Hello, my beautiful friends. I'm here today to talk a little bit about The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. From the moment I first started it up and emerged from the Shrine of Resurrection, I knew that this was going to be a very special game. So perhaps unsurprisingly, when I finally got around to reviewing it, I really wanted to give it my all. I wanted to talk about nearly every aspect of the game, from its triumphs to its failures and everything in between. As you can probably tell by the length of this video, I did just that. There may be a few tiny stones I left unturned in the end, but it's really not many. For the most part, if I had an opinion on it, it came out. Now, I've been calling this a review, and you'll hear me continue to refer to it as such throughout, though I'm not completely sure that's accurate anymore. I mean, technically, yes, here I'm doing largely what one does in a review. But when I hear the word review, it makes me think of game critics telling people their thoughts on a game so that those people can make more informed purchasing decisions. But that's just not what's happening here. Or at least I'm willing to bet that's not happening a whole lot. By now, most people have either played Breath of the Wild or decided that one day they will play Breath of the Wild. And I'd also bet that most people who are willing to watch a video this long on the game are probably not in the teeny tiny camp of people who are still trying to figure out if it's right for them. This is more of a breakdown of the game's design, a critique of all its pieces, sort of review, sort of analysis. So I've recently decided to rebrand this kind of long-form analytical deep dive look at a game to separate it from my regular reviews, thus the title. This review of Breath of the Wild has become a big fat review of Breath of the Wild. A seemingly subtle change, but I think it makes a big difference. Originally, this review slash big fat review what have you was released in 7 separate parts, but here I've compiled them all into one long watching experience. Each part is mostly the same as it was when originally published, though here and there you'll see a few notes and addendums popping up on screen. Not a ton, so don't worry about missing them or anything, just a few bits of info I felt should be added. And naturally, seeing as this is a nearly 3.5-hour video dissecting every element of Breath of the Wild, I'll warn you now that yes, there are spoilers ahead. All of the spoilers, in fact. As I said, when writing this, nothing in the game was off limits, and that included all the mechanics, all the enemies, the story beats, and even the final boss and ending. Also know that while there will always be visual elements to accompany the voiceover, including the aforementioned notes, and maybe a handful of gags that you have to see to get, for the most part you can probably just listen to this whole thing without having to watch. You know, if you're into listening to me talk about Zelda while you clean the house or drive across the state or something. With all that said, I think it's time to get started. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to present to you my big fat review of The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. When Breath of the Wild was first revealed back at E3, back when we still referred to it as Zelda U, I watched the reveal teaser. Later that year, I watched the precious few moments of gameplay gifted unto us at the Game Awards. 2 whole E3s later, they gave us the full reveal trailer with the game's name and basic mechanics and some monsters and locales. And that was the stop of the Breath of the Wild preview tour where I got off. I did not want to see anymore. Unfortunately, stuff inevitably slipped through the cracks. Whenever a juicy new trailer popped up in a Nintendo Direct or something, I always peeked between my fingers here and there, and sure enough, every time I did, something was spoiled and I regretted it horribly. I've talked about this before, but if you're not aware, I am hypersensitive to spoilery material. To me, a spoiler isn't just, this character dies at the end, or it turns out it was all a dream. To me, a spoiler is anything that I would have delighted in discovering for myself. If I know everything there is to know about a game going in, every kind of guy I'm gonna fight, every item I'm gonna get, every place I'm gonna see, a lot of the magic is gone. The simple act of playing out a video game isn't the only important thing to me. I want a game, especially a game as huge and important as Breath of the Wild, to be like an experience, an event in my life, something special. So I went in as blind as I reasonably could as a guy who talks about games on YouTube. And I'll tell you right now, I'm so glad I did. Breath of the Wild is obviously a great game all on its own. Spoiler alert, by the way, it's a great game. But I'm not exaggerating when I say that an immeasurably huge amount of my enjoyment came from not knowing much going in. While I basically never like to know too much about any game, avoiding spoilers had never before meant as much as it did here. And that's because no other game I've played has contained such a wealth of delightful things to discover. You see, I'd always dreamed of this massive game where you could just go wherever you wanted and the world was beautiful and magical and you'd actually find interesting stuff. I would run through the world of Shadow of the Colossus thinking, this is so close. It was visually spectacular, it was enormous, it got my imagination running wild, But beyond 16 colossi, which you had to hunt down in order, and I guess like fruit and lizards and stuff to eat to increase your gauges, there was simply nothing to find. It was just a set. A really big, beautiful, amazing set, but a set. There was nothing really to do except enjoy the scenery. And of course, some other open world games have gotten close to delivering what I wanted. Take a game like Skyrim, for instance, which is huge, beautiful, filled with quests, and completely open for you to explore at your own pace. It's hard to pin down exactly why Skyrim didn't quite do it for me. I loved it, but it didn't contain that certain kind of magic I was looking for. It could be because most of the game boiled down to killing guys and looting them. Find a cave or a dungeon or a sewer or anything, run through it and kill the guys and grab all the loot. Plenty of surprising stuff to come upon, and that's why it was certainly close, but something was still missing. Breath of the Wild, though, is the game I was waiting for all those years. And really, it's surprising that it turned out that way. When Aonuma claimed that the Great Plateau, the huge, sprawling area available to play around in at hands-on events, was only about 1% of the total map, I think more than a few of us grew a little concerned. I mean, how much stuff can you possibly develop for a world that big? How can there be enough to actually do? Because it doesn't matter if a game world is 1,000 miles across if you're just running forever and not finding anything. But the Zelda team pulled it off. They made the world beautiful and teeming with interesting geography and ruined buildings and just a wide assortment of unique sights to happen upon, and they also packed it to the gills with dudes to kill and stuff to loot. But the two things that make Breath of the Wild the game I always wanted to play are shrines and Koroks. And I think it's because, for one, they're just all over the place. 120 shrines and 900 Koroks mean the world is just packed with them. There's no place in Hyrule where you'll just not come upon shrines and Koroks, meaning that no matter where you find yourself, you're always on the hunt. But more importantly, though, they so perfectly satisfy my exploration craving because they strike a balance between useful and fun to find. See, if useful stuff is scattered everywhere and all you gotta do is pick it up, it's not as fun. The game becomes a collectathon at that point. The idea is just to kind of waste your time. But then if there's stuff that actually takes thought to find, but that stuff isn't really that useful, then, well, what's the point in looking for it? Also much less fun. Shrines and Koroks, though? They're perfect. Shrines because they give you spirit orbs, 4 of which can be exchanged for either another heart container or an extra bit on your stamina meter. Hearts mean more here than they have in any other 3D Zelda by far, and stamina aids in your ability to move through the world, climbing higher surfaces and gliding further primarily. And of course, each shrine is just a fun challenge to beat, which we'll touch more on later, but that's what makes them even more satisfying to find. Then Koroks are great because they increase the number of weapons and shields you can hold, and in this world of breakable stuff, this just makes you stronger. It takes more and more Korok seeds for each pouch upgrade, and you'll be maxed out after getting roughly half of them, but as long as it's making any difference at all, I am pleased as punch to obtain each one. And let's talk some more about why the finding of these things is so much fun, starting with shrines. Out of everything the game offers, shrines keep things the most interesting. They provide the most unique scenarios. They require so many different things of you to be uncovered. It can be rolling a snowball on the right path down a hill so it crashes open a door, lighting some inconspicuous torches, tracking down and taking pictures of statue fragments, defeating a family of Hinoxes, getting a group of Rito kids together to sing a song. The list goes on and on and on. I can't even properly describe how awesome it felt to set foot on Eventide Isle, or in that one place where it's super dark, or in any of the Great Labyrinths. It was such a huge rush. It was the sense that I'd discovered something really awesome and was now faced with some sort of fun challenge. Some of these shrines offer nice loot, but for the most part, the prize is always the same: a spirit orb. Again though, I never care. Spirit orbs are incredibly useful, and earning them by doing all this crazy stuff just makes the whole thing that much more fun. It's this feeling of constant reward no matter where I'm going or what I'm doing. And you know me, I feel that variety is the spice of video games. If all the shrines are fun and interesting to find, the fact that they come in so many different packages just multiplies that fun. Plenty of them, of course, are simply sitting in plain sight, and this is great. It's something of a palate cleanser between trickier shrines. You don't want to get completely tired of solving riddles and doing obscure stuff, and it's great that you can mark them from a distance so you can just come back to them later when you want to accomplish something a little more straightforward. Plus, seeing them from towers is just exciting. Whenever you stand up on a tower you've just unlocked and you spot all those red blobs all around you, you're invigorated by the task at hand, by the idea of pressing into a gigantic new territory. But, of course, even better, there's this unmatched sense of wonder when you're just running around in the mountains doing nothing and you see something weird and you go, "What on earth is that?" And you investigate for a while, then wonder turns to joy and triumph when you realize that yes, it's a shrine! My first time through, I especially loved Cass's riddles. Most of them were pretty easy to solve, but there were a few that made me feel awesome when I got to the bottom of things. If I had to pick a favorite, it would probably be the one where you have to find a spot where you can shoot an arrow through two of those stones with holes in them. I love to sit around and ponder in any game. I love to stare at a problem from all different angles and think about it for a while. And of course, that was a challenge that was so unlike the rest of them. There were so many that were so unlike the rest of them. Next, of course, we got the Koroks, and it's funny because they're so much less flashy and substantial than shrines. I mean, with one, you've got a jillion-year-old structure rising up out of the earth and taking you down into a trial meant to test the legendary hero with all sorts of weird magical technology, and with the other, you pick up a rock and it's like, poof, haha, you found me, here's a seed, bye! But the effect these little creatures had on me, especially in the early hours of the game, was immense. If shrines instilled within me a sense of wonder, Koroks instilled a childish delight that was just as strong and just as magical. Just like with shrines, this is largely because there are just so many of them hidden throughout the world. Outside of the divine beasts, there is no place in the entire game world where you can't find some Koroks if you look hard enough. It means that running through nearly my entire experience with the game, there was this constant knowledge that I might find something at any moment, a constant need to pay attention to my surroundings. They also act as a system of constant micro rewards for simply running and climbing and looking wherever you can, like a kid playing out in the forest. Climb a mountain? Have a Korok. Look inside a hollow log? Have a Korok. Make your way to the tippiest, most tippy top of Hyrule Castle? Well, look at that. On top of your own sense of accomplishment, how about a Korok for your troubles? No good deed goes unrewarded. Also, as it is with shrines, it's very important that on top of their immense numbers, there are also an immense number of ways to find them. There are so many that even now, after over 200 hours of Breath of the Wild, I'm still not certain I've seen every kind of hiding place. Every time I think I've seen them all, I find something weird and poof, another one. Didn't see that coming, did ya? I called it childish delight because, like a child, is exactly how I feel when I track one of the little guys down. I feel like shouting, "Found you! Ha ha!" They turn this huge world into a great big toy, or a game on top of a game. Try to remember what it felt like when you were little and you opened a mysterious Christmas gift to find something cool inside, or you pressed a button on a toy and were delighted by what it did. For me, that's the same kind of feeling I get when I see something a little off and I go, nah, I'm sure it's nothing. But then I check it out anyway, and I fiddle with it, still going, no, I really don't think this is anything. I think I'm making this up. And then I put a rock where I feel like it should be, and poof! It was totally a Korok! And the kid inside of me squeals with glee like a toddler when their dad pops up from behind the couch with a silly face. And Nintendo knew this was how I'd feel too. It was completely deliberate. Why else would they include a victory chime in that little poof? It's straight up like one of those party poppers. It's meant to instantly hit you with that happy feeling of winning a prize. Shrines and Koroks may be the main attractions when it comes to exploration, but even beyond those, the game still has more surprises in store. And again, if I'd known about any of this ahead of time, none of it would have had a big impact on me. I had to immerse myself in the world and stumble upon it all naturally in order to really feel that sense of wonder. Here were some of my favorite surprises. The first time I came upon a Yiga foot soldier disguised as a traveler. I'm talking to some friendly girl, and suddenly she cheerily says something about killing the legendary hero, and I'm like, what now? Then she tells me she's gonna bring her master my head and turns into a stinking ninja and attacks me. I would have never seen that coming in a million years. It was so out of the blue and really pretty scary for a Zelda game. It's just like, this is not a monster. This human person wants to murder me. Then the dragons. Oh man, this was a big one. I'm walking along one day and I spot some long little squirmy wormy thing up in the sky, way out in the distance. I can't even see what it is and it disappears. Okay, weird. Later I'm walking and I see the thing closer and I see, oh, what is that? I look a little bit, oh yeah, it's a big dragon just flying around on its own. I have no idea if it's good or bad or wants to eat me or just wants to chill up there. But really seeing it for the first time gave me goosebumps. It was incredible. It was one of those really intense this game moments. You know, when you're really blown away by a game and it just keeps surprising you and you can only go, this game, man, this game. Then later I'm doing stuff up on the northern edge of Death Mountain and suddenly there's a strange breeze. I wonder what— The divine beasts were similar to the dragons. I had no idea at all that they existed, not a clue, and I'm so glad, because finding these things and coming to terms with the fact that there were utterly gigantic robotic beasts just chilling around Hyrule was mind-blowing. It was the kind of pure, just coolness that I adore. Va Medo hangs out up in the sky, and it was always this weird little speck that I had no idea what it was. I even remembered seeing it in trailers and stuff, just this weird little thing hanging up in the distance. And at some point, I finally got close enough to get a good look at it, and holy cow, it's a bird. It's a giant robot bird. I am not getting near that thing. Then you've got Va Rudania, which circles around Death Mountain, and this one was fun. It was a happy coincidence that for a very large amount of the game, it just happened to be on the other side of the mountain whenever I looked. Because then one random time, I'm just surveying the landscape, and I look at Death Mountain from super far away, mind you. Just looking at this gigantic mountain rising up out of the earth, the tallest point on the map, and suddenly something starts moving. A creature, easily visible from where I am, is crawling around the mountain. And the feeling in my gut is equal parts wonder and horror. Another good horrific one was the first time I saw a Lionel. The Zora just kept telling me about some beast way up on the mountain and how I would need to go get shock arrows from it. This in itself was scary and weird because they were talking about it like a beast. An animal, and animals don't have the capacity to shoot you with a bow and arrow. Only sapient creatures can do that. So what in the heck was this thing anyway? The anticipation climbing up that mountain was intense. Turning the corner, I had just absolutely positively no idea what I expected to see. Then, finally seeing it, and most importantly, seeing how easily it could murder me from a mile away was purely terrifying. And I know I mentioned the labyrinths already, but I can't stress enough how awesome they are. I found the one on the top right corner of the map first, and it was this huge, weird square of something out in the distance. I didn't even think I could reach it, but after I flew there, I felt like I'd busted into some weird ancient prison and was about to be blasted by a guardian at any second. It was one of the most thrilling experiences I've had in a Zelda game. Look, I could go on and on, but you get the idea here. I just can't believe they managed to make a game this big with so many things to discover, so many things that are delightful or scary or breathtaking. Again and again and again, you're thrown into scenarios and you just have no idea what's about to happen. If there was one phrase I uttered most during my time with Breath of the Wild, it was, "What on earth?" So many times I would spot something weird and that's what I would say. What on earth? What is that? And running ahead to find out was always a magical feeling. There's still a lot to talk about with this game. Combat, art style, story, all that video gamey stuff. But I don't think any of it's as important as that magic. It's what makes the game more than just a great game. It's what makes it a special game. An experience that I'll probably carry with me for the rest of my life. Because even if Nintendo or another developer makes another game that's just as magical, or even more so, Breath of the Wild will always be a first. Exploration has always been one of my favorite things about video games as a whole, and Breath of the Wild will always be the first time exploration in a game was everything I wanted it to be. The first time I played a game that I had previously only dreamed of. For some reason, sound and presentation are often hard for me to fit into a review. I don't know, I think I just focus so much on the gameplay and the mechanics and whatnot that it takes a lot of effort to transition naturally into that stuff. How fortunate then that we've got an entire chunk of this review to talk about it without interruptions. Because oh man, I gotta tell you guys, Breath of the Wild is a pretty game for both your eyes and your ears. But let's start with eyes. Nintendo is used to using below par hardware in order to provide a more affordable console. They've been doing it for over a decade now. They're also used to getting the absolute most out of their hardware in both technical and artistic terms. Breath of the Wild is a classic example of art style winning out over sheer graphical power. Because honestly, on paper, the game ain't much in the graphics department. Character models are a little simplistic and they use that Wind Waker-esque style of cell shading so they don't have as much texturing or detail. There are no dazzling particle effects or anything like that. Very little of the game's visuals could be considered complex, maybe outside of the humongous divine beasts or something. Performance is really where it suffers most. The frame rate sometimes has a hard time keeping up with the action on screen. It's not usually so bad that it becomes a distraction, but it's certainly not the kind of performance I've come to expect with a first-party Nintendo game. It slows considerably in Kakariko Village, and slows even more in Korok Forest, to the point where I'm honestly surprised they allowed the game to ship this way. It's really bizarre playing a Zelda title where the game stutters this much. The game's resolution ain't the best, but it ain't terrible either. Like many Switch games, it seems things to scale depending on what's going on, employing all different kinds of rendering techniques and layers of anti-aliasing and whatnot to different things in order to keep the balance between visuals and frame rate as much as possible. I have no doubt that this often does make things look and run better than they could, but other times it makes things look disturbingly inconsistent. We see patches of textures jumping around and objects with polygon counts that scale up and down very visibly. Now, I can see that this was the sacrifice they needed to make in order to create a world that was constant, truly open. There are no loading screens on this map. You can run from one end to the other, climb the highest mountain, go into a town, a house even, then out again and all the way to Hyrule Castle and up through the entire thing and up to Ganon's weird goopy pod thing, and you'll never have to stop to load once. It really is impressive. And with a world this big, you want to be able to see as much as possible from a distance without pop-in, which means just about everything is always rendered in some fashion if it's visible to you. And that's why you have this active resolution scaling system that makes one thing smooth and one thing jagged and another thing smooth and then jagged. It also makes the landscape, in a way, a little less pretty than it probably could have been. It's certainly pretty for reasons we'll talk about in a bit, but if you saw my first impressions video, you'll remember that I found it a little more muddy than I expected. Distant mountains just look a little bit yucky when you look at them long enough, like when you really focus on them. And let me tell you now, all this bad stuff is leading up to a lot of good stuff, and again, this was all done in order to achieve that complete openness, that ability to look at everything from any angle. They didn't have the benefit of pre-rendering a bunch of perfect picturesque landscapes, and that's of course a very fine trade-off. It means the game performs the way they wanted it to, with little to no pop-in. For the most part, people and monsters are the only things that pop in, though you can usually see them from far enough away that it's not a big problem. The only monster that proves troublesome in this regard is the Hinox. You can be pretty darn close to the thing before, boink, it's suddenly there. And this is of course more of a problem because the Hinox is the biggest baddie in the game. You always want to be able to plan where you're going and know for the most part what you'll find when you get there, but Hinoxes can sometimes surprise you. At least they're always sleeping, so they won't see you unless you run up real close. But seeing one of their big circular sleeping spots ahead of you for ages before the game decides to populate it can be jarring. Enough of that though. Despite the game's visual shortcomings, it's still positively gorgeous. Even if no single piece of it is technically impressive or particularly sharp, all the elements combine together to paint one very beautiful picture. It really is much like a painting in that regard. Up close, the brushstrokes can look pretty rough and nothing is very finely detailed, but when you step back, it all comes together because the artist knew exactly how to achieve the overall image they wanted using all those individual pieces. If there's one single most important element that makes the game look so good, it's probably the lighting. I mean, Breath of the Wild single-handedly taught me how huge good lighting can be in a game. You spend so much time out in the wilderness running around under the sky so that day-night cycle is ever moving, and no matter what time of day it is, you're treated to a visual feast. Cloud cover is basically constant, so you never get plain old bright sun shining on a blue sky. You get beautiful shades of color that paint the world differently depending on where the sun is or where the clouds shift. Rainy weather has never felt more real in a Zelda game. It's never done so much to affect the atmosphere. Running through moonlight is simply stunning, and if you happen to find yourself in view of the ocean when the sun comes up, it's a particularly splendid sight. It doesn't matter how many times I see it happen or how long I play the game. When that sun starts to come up, I stop and I take a moment. I watch the light grow on the horizon, delighting in the vibrant colors as they fill up the sky. And speaking of colors, part of the reason the lighting is so effective is the game's use of a very soft color palette. Gentle greens and browns and yellows make up the bulk of what you'll see in the world above. There are some times when I do miss more vibrant colors. Whenever I use Breath of the Wild footage in a video, I've got to crank up the contrast a good few notches to make it pop a little more on screen. Last gen, the game industry fell into this weird thing where everything was really brown, and I've really appreciated recent efforts to use the full color spectrum. I mean, look at something like Horizon Zero Dawn. It's gorgeous. However, Breath of the Wild's minimalistic use of color helps achieve two things, and in fact, these are two things that the game does on a broad scale and that run through every aspect of its presentation and sound design, as you will soon see. Sticking to the subject of color for the time being though, the first thing is that the game has this theme of age, of history. I can't exactly think of one word to describe it, but it elicits feelings of time gone by. The soft color makes it look like old film or an old photograph or a painting. It feels like it comes from a time when people just didn't have access to bright, high-contrast colors in visual mediums. This is a reflection of the state the world is in. Hyrule was ravaged by Ganon's forces so long ago, and much of the game is about tapping into the past, recovering memories, accomplishing tasks that others couldn't 100 years ago. Time has passed, but in terms of civilization, the world hasn't really been able to move on and completely heal. It's basically just as it was back then, much as though it were a photograph. The other thing the game is going for, and that is very much supported by the color palette, is establishing atmosphere. Now, the interesting thing here is that up until now, atmosphere in a Zelda game pretty much meant one of two things: happy or scary. The atmosphere being established was either the bright, happy cartoonishness of Wind Waker and a few others, or the dark, eerie foreboding we saw in games like Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess. But Breath of the Wild is different. The atmosphere it creates is one of serenity. It's relaxing, it's peaceful, it's beautiful. Which is funny because never before has a Zelda game been this dangerous and demanding, but of course we'll really talk about that later. Now, this isn't to say that no Zelda ever has gone for a kind of atmosphere that is neither happy and silly nor scary. It's obviously more complicated than that. But off the top of my head, every instance of a calm atmosphere in a Zelda game, aided by atmospheric music, places that really make you stop and just take it in, they almost always carried something of an eeriness to them. Staring up at the architecture in Ocarina of Time's Temple of Time while the Song of Time plays like a Gregorian chant. It was effective, but also very somber, almost demanding of a respectful reverence. The snowy area in Twilight Princess. It's serene, but danger lurks just beneath the surface. Strange wolves are stalking you, you're chasing a monster, you don't know what you'll find up on the mountain. The list goes on. To my knowledge, the Zelda team has never zeroed in on the sheer beauty of the world and of nature itself as they have in Breath of the Wild. At the very least, they've never featured it as a theme that runs through an entire game. Ganon tried to conquer the world. There was a huge war, tons of people died, entire villages were destroyed, there was fire everywhere, it was a gigantic mess. And yet, the deer don't know that. The grass doesn't care. The sun and the moon keep on going up and coming down. Sure, maybe if Ganon were to finally win and dominate everything before him, nature would have a problem with it, but here, nature is just nature. And nature is beautiful. It's indifferent to your adventuring or all the monsters that are everywhere or the war that went down 100 years ago. It's the same as it is in the real world, and it's a fascinating thing to see in a Zelda game. And of course, it makes traversing the landscape that much more enjoyable. That atmosphere grants the player with a near constant feeling of calm. But now that we're past color, let's start talking about art direction. Character designs are interesting because we've got a really big range of complexity here. Hylians and the Sheikah, which for all intents and purposes are Zelda's human characters, are quite plain. Like, surprisingly so. They just look like people without a lot of really striking standout features. And the funny thing is, I kinda like it that way. The rest of the world is so astoundingly beautiful that the people themselves become something like the background. They just don't need to look more detailed than they do, and in fact, this is an interesting thing to look at in past Zelda games. In Wind Waker, for instance, I was fine with weird-looking characters because the whole world was like a colorful cartoon. It all meshed. But as much as I loved Twilight Princess, I remember being a little distracted by some of the characters. The world was dark and largely realistic, but you still had these weirdly cartoony dudes with bizarre faces, and they didn't seem to fit very well. The Hylians and Sheikah in Breath of the Wild are simple, but that perfectly matches the simple beauty of the world. But then, of course, to keep things interesting, you've got your less human-like races, your Zoras, Gorons, Gerudo, and Rito. Imaginary races are what really stick out in a fantasy world, and as such, these are designed appropriately. They really pop, they catch your attention. The Zora and the Rito, fish people and bird people respectively, have very unique designs here. They're much more like animals and less like humans than they were in previous games. I mean, the Rito used to just look like people with feathers glued to their arms and beaks glued over their noses. Here the Rito really look like bird people. The Zora really look like fish people. And there are different designs for different characters using different species as reference points. This Zora's like a hammerhead shark. This one's like some kind of ray. That Rito there is kind of like an eagle. This one is obviously a parrot. Then the Gorons look fantastic, as Gorons tend to do. I will say they lack the same creativity seen in Twilight Princess, with the Goron elders in particular, but there's definitely a great range of character models on display. And if there's one thing these Gorons do better than any others, it's convey emotion. Facial animations are superb, and their great big faces show them off better than any other race in the game. Plus, more of them have got hair now. I mean, that sends the personality potential through the roof. Lastly, you've got Gerudo, and the developers obviously had a lot of fun tweaking the original design here. Just like Gerudo of old, they've got darker skin and angular faces with large noses, but much greater emphasis has now been put on their height, specifically how much taller they are than most of the other races. They've also got, well, let's just say, very interesting body shapes. While we're talking about the people of Breath of the Wild, let's talk about the architecture. Each race has its own building style, and every town looks wildly different, adding a nice layer to the world's sense of realism. The Hylians have Hateno, an idyllic little village nestled in the hills, and Lurelin, an oceanside trading settlement. The Sheikah have their mountain village that utilizes ancient Japanese-style architecture. In fact, much like the Yiga clan, who broke off from the Sheikah, their entire culture is very Japanese. Once again, though, these pale in comparison to Hyrule's more fantastical races. You've got Gerudo Town, which is reminiscent of ancient desert-dwelling cultures. There's probably one specific one it's based on, but obviously I didn't pay attention in history class. Is it Egypt? Yeah, it's probably Egypt. That might be the least impressive one, though, and probably because the Gerudo are closest to humans out of the 4 unique races, so that naturally made the designers want to model their culture after real ones. Zora's domain, though, is easily the most impressive. Let me tell you, folks, the Zora have come a long way since living in caves in Ocarina of Time. Here, they're natural architects, and they've built a city above the water in a big mountaintop basin that glistens with luminous stone and other natural deposits. The design is complex and beautiful. It reminds you of the ocean, but it's also sort of futuristic. Easily the most visually spectacular individual area of the game. And it's cool because it reflects the Zora culture. They've got a long and storied history of fighting wars and of heroic champions. They've got a throne room with a monarch who sits on a throne and their ceremonial scepters and all that. It's all very fitting. Compare this to the Gorons, who just kind of live in caves like usual. The style here is much more down to earth. The Gorons don't do fancy. They're practical. They're hard workers, and that's about it. The structures are roughly hewn, and you've got metal bits and equipment lying around everywhere. The lava and the overall on-fire atmosphere certainly make it interesting, but I think going into the game, I was hoping for a little more. The Zoras just set my expectations so high, you know? But even though this is called Goron City, that's really a stupid name because it's not a city at all. It's barely a village. It's very tiny and kind of grouped together. I was hoping for some staggering mountain city with all sorts of levels and stuff to check out like in Ocarina of Time, but I will certainly say this way still works perfectly, and in fact, it's much more in line with what I would expect of the Gorons. It's not even a real gripe, just a little detail the kid in me was hoping for. And lastly, we've got the Rito, who, just like the rest of the races, live in a place that perfectly represents who they are. The Rito are bird people, first of all, and they're also very quiet and dignified. Their village spirals up a huge rocky pillar and consists of nothing more than stairs, landing platforms, and small wooden huts. The whole thing is very modest in terms of architecture. Even the Rito elder lives in one of these little huts, the singular difference being that his is at the top. You can observe the people here living peacefully, most often indulging in quiet reflection, obviously enjoying the view of the surrounding landscape that their towering town affords. Zora's domain blew me away with its architecture, but on a more personal level, Rito Village might be my favorite. I won't try to claim that it's as spectacular, but looking at it from a distance and being in it just makes me feel happy. It establishes such a great mood, and it's the only town in the game that has its own sort of shape that you can see from the distance, you know? Especially when Va Medo perches on the top, it becomes a very unique landmark. So that's all the architecture that the currently alive people of Hyrule built and are currently enjoying, but perhaps even more interesting is the stuff that's been left behind. Ganon was stopped from completely destroying the world 100 years ago, but it was a close thing. The vast majority of the world's structures have been reduced to rubble, and you can find these relics of the past everywhere. And this, of course, ties in both with the theme of age and with the atmosphere the developers were trying to establish. And the atmosphere thing is a huge one. I said earlier that the general mood of the game is peaceful without being too ominous or eerie or whatever, and that's certainly true, but Hyrule's ruins elicit another unique kind of feel. Seeing ruins buried under earth and covered in vines and such is a very peaceful thing in real life, and it's no different in the game. It's all just very still, and even if you don't consciously acknowledge it, you know that it's all been there for a very long time, just as quiet and still as always. But beyond that, there's a sadness that runs through the game. You can see the remains of what this place used to be, and if you think on it deeply enough, you imagine all the people that must have died. I mean, there are entire villages that are just gone. You'll constantly find the broken remains of people's houses, even with some rotted furniture within the crumbled walls. You have to wonder if these people got out in time. I was bummed that I didn't discover this on my own and had to hear about it online, and if you haven't figured it out yet, it's doubtful that you will, so I'm mentioning it here. There's a spot out in Hyrule Field called the Ranch Ruins, and if you look closely, you'll notice that the layout directly matches that of Lon Lon Ranch in Ocarina of Time. Obviously, because of what we know of the timeline, these aren't actually the ruins of that exact version of Lon Lon Ranch, but the callbacks still made me really stop and think when I went and checked them out. It was legitimately heartbreaking to look at the rubble and remember how it once looked. These weren't quite as emotional for me, but Hyrule Castle and Hyrule Castle Town are also very sad. This was once the heart of Hyrule, and this heart has never been depicted so grandly as it is here in its destroyed state. The castle is gargantuan and beautifully constructed. Even ruined and crumbling and covered in black gunk and crawling with baddies as it is, it's a sight to behold, and the sheer size of it once more reminds you of just how many people once lived within the walls. In addition to ruined structures, there are also remnants of the war scattered throughout the land. I can't stress enough how important this addition is to the feel of the game. War hasn't come up much in Zelda games. A few are referenced. We know people once fought over the Triforce. We know Hyrule's Royal Guard have been wiped out a few times. But for the most part, when there's fighting to be done, the hero does it. No one else really takes part. But places like Fort Hiteno make the war 100 years ago real. This time around, there's a tremendous amount of tangible evidence that the people of Hyrule once had to really fight for their lives. And if you ask me, that makes the lore so much more effective on an emotional level than that of any other Zelda. Lastly, I want to talk about the Temple of Time, because I feel that it's really important in establishing the tone of the game. We're used to the Temple of Time being important. You find the Master Sword there in a number of games. It houses the entrance to the Spirit Realm, for Pete's sake. In Breath of the Wild, it's one of the very first things you're drawn to. From the very start of the game, you get to see this Zelda landmark in ruins. It's still technically standing, but it's clear that it's broken beyond repair. The roof is falling in, there are bokoblins squatting inside. It's where the old man eventually reveals his true identity, and it's got one of the game's many statues of Hylia, but that's it. You don't come back later and restore it. You don't travel through time to when it was still intact like in Twilight Princess. You don't do anything with it because it's ruined. It was destroyed in the war, and just like most of Hyrule, now it's nothing. And this realization was heavy for me. It communicated, perhaps better than anything, the extent of the damage caused by Ganon and the senselessness of war. But wait, Arlo, you might be saying, you said earlier that the other games establish bad vibe atmospheres, whereas Breath of the Wild focuses on serenity. What about all this sad stuff you're talking about? Isn't that a pretty bad vibe? Explain yourself. Well, you see, the difference here, and this is completely genius, is that the sadness on display in this version of Hyrule is purely implicit. This game doesn't establish a mood by messing with the lighting or making you all ooged out with ominous music. It doesn't try to scare you or force you into feeling any negative feelings because it's all visual. It's all implied. When you see the remains of a town or Lon Lon Ranch or whatever it is, your own imagination and empathy are what make you feel something. Especially considering all this is set against that very peaceful backdrop with its relaxing music, it should be very easy to feel nothing but pleasure while you move through the world. But I, at least, have never felt emotions this strong while running through a sunlit field of flowers while I'm serenaded by a delightful piano score. We've got a few more things to cover before we move on to that score, though. Even apart from the land structures, intact or otherwise, the land itself is beautifully constructed. Again, it's not so much a graphical horsepower thing. Nothing in the game looks better than something from Gen 7, and in fact, I've played plenty of Xbox 360 games that look loads better. Though, to the game's credit, the rocks look great. I don't know why they put so much detail into the rocks, but man, look at that rock. Point is, though, the world is gorgeous because of style and composition. There are certainly some recycled assets here and there. You'll spot a few rocks or whatever and be like, yeah, I've definitely seen those around a few times. But for the most part, the entire world looks as though it was figuratively handcrafted. Every hill and valley and mountain, the different ways the plants grow and the trees group together, the different rock formations, it all feels so real. It feels so much like you are walking through a real fantasy landscape rather than a collection of areas compiled by a team of programmers. Nature and landscape and all that in previous games has always been more of an artistic affair. It seemed as though it was all designed by designers who draw out images and help create assets. It always looked great in its own artistic way, don't get me wrong, but it's clear that this time they spent ages studying how nature really works, how a landscape is actually formed geologically. We've had snow places and lava places and desert places and all that in Zelda games before, but never has it felt like I was truly scaling a volcano, or or a snowy mountain, or running across a sandy wasteland. Much of this is because of reasons we won't touch on quite yet, but so much of it is plain old incredible design. Much like in our own world, when you're in the middle of nature, you can look in just about any direction and you've got yourself one heck of a painting. There's beauty to be found in every corner of the map. Forget the shrines and the monsters and saving the world and all that junk. I've never been so absorbed by a game's world alone before. Never have I so thoroughly enjoyed just being in it. Skyrim and Shadow of the Colossus came close, those games were really gorgeous, but something about Breath of the Wild's particular style edges them out. When I was a kid, I used to boot up Ocarina of Time just to start at Kakariko Village and climb all the way to the very top of Death Mountain and sit there for a while, admiring the landscape, watching the sun rise and set. It was the first time I ever wanted to be in a game, and Breath of the Wild is probably the only case where that feeling has ever come back just as strongly. Not much more to cover in the visual department. Monster designs and animations are stellar as always. The designers gave each of the lesser baddie races that hang around camps and whatnot their own body language, and it gives them a great sense of liveliness. They're all very expressive. The Lizalfos in particular are fun to watch, with their chameleon-like eyes darting around and their hunched composure and the way they curiously tilt their heads all around like birds. The bigger enemies like Hinoxes and Lynels aren't as pleasantly expressive, but they're still well designed. Especially the Lynels. Talk about intimidating. Not as much enemy variety as I would like. Sometimes I do get a little tired staring at the same handful of guys throughout the whole game, but at least what we've got is awesome. Each and every baddie feels really unique and fun. Guardians, shrines, and all the futuristic technology contained within shrines are awesome because they help solidify the game's themes by, interestingly enough, acting as strong contrasts to them. Guardians and shrines are the polar opposite of nearly everything we've been talking about. Most of the game uses soft, warm colors, everything is made of wood and stone, it all feels very natural. So seeing one of those metal monstrosities skittering around like a spider with its glowing blue eye and its laser beam attack helps heighten tension on top of the tension that naturally comes from confronting a dangerous foe. These things are clearly unnatural, they clearly don't belong here. And it's great because we know that these are very old and yet they're futuristic because of the cyclical nature of Hyrule's tech. Things become very advanced, then for whatever reason it all gets left behind for later generations to rediscover. We've seen it in a good number of Zelda titles now. Shrines are fun because they're kinda eyesores. They're these nasty little glowing protrusions dotting the landscape. They were put in place here by much more advanced people, and the rest of the world has since gone on around them. When you step onto that elevator, you leave your world of open sky and green grass and frolicking deer and instantly find yourself in a world of metal and machines and sharp blues. And blue is, of course, the least common color in nature. Even Breath of the Wild's sky isn't as blue as it could be with its constant cloud cover, so blue is all the more effective here at representing things that come from a very different time. And with such a large game featuring so many things to do above ground, shrines with all their blues and machines work to break the game up visually. They sort of refresh your palate with a new set of flavors every once in a while, so you don't get tired of the more natural grass and sand and snow and all that. The game would have been perfectly fine without all the future-y tech stuff, but it adds such a delightful variety to the visuals that it makes the whole experience all the more rich. Also, let's not forget that it's just plain cool. Skyward Sword featured a lot of cool tech stuff, but Breath of the Wild takes it to a whole new level. When you're down in a shrine fighting robots and navigating through lasers and powering machines using big electrical balls, you're basically playing a sci-fi game. And though I doubt it will ever happen, it makes me even more hopeful that maybe someday we'll get a Zelda game that takes place during one of these eras of advanced technology. Cyberpunk Zelda, I want it so bad. Finally, we come to music and overall sound design. I don't have too much to say about the sound effects because this is a Zelda game. Even all the way back in Link's first 3D outings with sound as limited as it was on the N64, the game sounded great. These guys know Foley work, and they know how to perfectly blend it all into their games and make it sound very natural. Breath of the Wild is of course no exception. There are thousands of different sounds subtly layered into the game, and it's all so natural that it's easy to forget that this is a game you're playing. That when Link performs a certain action, that action only makes a noise because someone recorded a noise and stuck it into the code and told the game exactly when to play it. It feels like it just happens on its own. Like, yeah, of course it makes that sound when Link puts away a weapon or throws a rock or whatever. The music, though, does deserve a bit of a closer look. Like most things in the game, it matches the two main themes, age and serenity. For the first time ever, the piano takes center stage, versus other Zelda games which have most prominently featured more traditional orchestral instruments such as horns and and violins. And music may be another department that Zelda has always excelled in, but never has it been so subtle and natural. Just like the open world with its lack of barriers and loading screens, the music never really ends. It just changes. It moves with you, reflecting your surroundings. And since so much of the surrounding world is filled with serenity and beauty, these soft piano tunes reflect that most often. There are indeed higher tempo songs and ones with stronger melodies and all that, but for the most part, the music in Breath of the Wild takes something of a back seat. Whereas past Zeldas featured a lot of music that had you humming along, this game wants as much as possible to add to the mood without you really thinking about it. Familiar melodies are present, but they're often folded into the music in less noticeable ways, and sometimes it took me a little while to catch them. And while sometimes I do miss having the more prominent tunes around, I can't deny the effect this style has on the game's atmosphere and feel. The developers already achieved so much in the visual department, and the music just ties it all together beautifully. It's the sort of thing that I imagine took a long time to experiment with and put together, as there are any number of elements that could have broken the mood if done just a little wrong. And like I said, the music also ties into the age theme. This is pretty interesting, and I'll admit, maybe this wasn't intentional at all, and I'm the only one that feels this way, but a lot of that has to do with the use of the piano. From our perspective, the piano and other orchestral instruments were all invented hundreds of years ago. They're old, basically. All of them, in theory, should be able to convey a sense of age. They're almost exclusively used to score movies and shows and games that take place in the past, at least in the Western world, but Breath of the Wild uses its piano in a different way. Instead of emulating the long ago days of grand classical music, it sometimes emulates a more recent time. More frequently being used as a solo instrument versus violins and horns and all that, it suggests a greater level of intimacy that calls, to my mind at least, the idea of smaller scale storytelling as seen in the 18 and 1900s. Picture plays and silent movies where the pianist sits off to the side and single-handedly scores entire productions. This is where the age theme comes in, which is funny because Breath of the Wild sometimes alludes to events that took place untold thousands of years in the past, yet like I said, its color palette often brings to mind old photos. There's a really big emphasis on what happened 100 years ago. And here's a detail I didn't mention before, but whenever Link recovers a memory, there's this effect that makes it look like an old silent movie for a second. Silent movies were being made about 100 years ago now, which makes this even more appropriate, seeing as Link's memories were a century old. Back to the music though, the piano strengthens this concept. It conveys a sense of age by subconsciously stirring up images of plays and silent movies in my mind. The single greatest example of this is the theme that plays when you encounter a Guardian Stalker. In any other Zelda game, spotting a foe like this might have just started up more of those horns and cellos, but here we get exactly the sort of jaunty piano tune you would hear in an old film about cowboys and bandits. Imagine an old-timey melodrama where a mustache-twiddling bad guy ties a helpless gal to the railroad tracks. Or imagine a kid up on a stage running around in a Guardian costume while their teacher pounds on the piano off to the side. That's what I think of when I hear the Guardian music. Now, the whole theme does include more than just the piano. It has a handful of future-y touches, and there's a violin in there helping carry things along, but that piano is at the forefront, especially right at the start when one of the things first spots you. That 5-note motif just pounds away repeatedly. And they could have easily ditched the piano entirely and use nothing but futuristic music here, like the kind they put down in the shrines. These Guardians are way older than just a century or two after all, yet they tie into that story of a Hyrule at war from 100 years ago, and because of my subconscious associations with that kind of piano tune, they feel like they fit more with the theme of age than if the style had been purely futuristic or even something actually older like a regular orchestration. Perhaps it's because I'm so used to futuristic themes being tied to big robots, or maybe I'm desensitized to traditional orchestral music, I don't know, but this unusual style is really effective. It makes me imagine how 100 years after the events of Breath of the Wild, people will be telling each other stories about how Link fought the Guardians. Finally, one more notable thing Breath of the Wild does in the music department is using very ambient sounds and instruments. Plenty piano, as we've established, and plenty of instances of more traditional instrumentation as well. But listening through the soundtrack, I'm amazed by how much of it truly falls into the ambient category, like the kind of stuff you hear in various genres of ambient music. Sounds that you can only get using a computer to generate waves and shift and stretch stuff in all sorts of weird ways. This naturally adds hugely to the serenity, and the fact that it's a pretty new thing for Zelda games increases the impact it has. Its otherworldly nature lets you know that you're playing a very different kind of Zelda game. And the funny thing is, despite how awesome I think it is, it took me a long time to notice. It's extremely subtle, and sometimes when music complements gameplay and a game world perfectly and helps establish just the right mood, I don't even notice that it's there. It affects me even though I'm not really thinking about it. And I tell ya, that is the mark of an awesome soundtrack right there. When taken as a whole, Breath of the Wild's presentation is really something else. It's easily the most ambitious Zelda in terms of how much love and care and time went into it, and how it all ties together. It's the most stylistically cohesive by a wide margin. The atmosphere it establishes is something truly special, and never have I played a game that made me stop and marvel as often as this one does, even on other more powerful systems. The dev team made so much out of relatively little, and more than ever, they've shown that yes, these games are art, and yes, the people working on them are artists. When we first learned that Breath of the Wild was going to feature a sprawling open world and that very little would ever stop you from going exactly where you wanted, I worried about the story. Story is very important to me in my Zelda games. The plot and all the twists and turns dramatically increased my enjoyment of Twilight Princess, and the weak plot, despite a few good lore revelations throughout, decreased my enjoyment of Skyward Sword. Thing is, good story is much easier to pull off in a game with a linear structure, which is what each 3D Zelda leading up to Breath of the Wild had. The plot points happened in a certain order, and certain areas were blocked off so that the story unfolded as you gathered items and opened them up. Open world games, though, much more difficult to pull off. Story beats have to happen without affecting the world too much so that the gameplay stays consistent. If you can go anywhere at any time, how do you effectively utilize your environments and your scripted events? How do you lead the player to each plot point without making it feel really unnatural? So when I learned about Breath of the Wild's open nature, I thought, well, surely this can't have much of a story. Then when I learned that you can cruise on up to Ganon at any time and that the only barrier is your own strength, I was like, well, that's it. There's clearly not going to be a plot at all if it has literally no bearing on beating the game. Then when I finally played it and saw how the story was handled, I was equal parts relieved and disappointed. Let's go over the good first, though. I will say that the formula the team came up with to tell their story was perfect. So much of the magic of the game comes from stepping out of that shrine with little more than a pair of pants and having no idea what's going on. From the very beginning, Breath of the Wild excels at passive storytelling. And while I don't mind being told a story actively, there's a certain charm and a sense of mystery that comes with being led to uncover things yourself. And in fact, this style helps complement the overall mood the game is going for. Take Metroid Prime, for example. When they're at their best, the Metroid games instill a sense of isolation in the player, and Prime is no exception. Samus is on this planet, its original inhabitants long gone. Apart from the native animals and her enemy, she's alone. The plot is one of simply finding a way to thwart the plans of the space pirates. The story, though, is told passively through scanning runes and log entries and through simply observing the world around you. Slowly uncovering what happened on the planet in this manner is somehow more rewarding because it's optional. Figuring stuff out on your own rather than being explicitly told everything through mandatory cutscenes comes with a sense of accomplishment. You feel like you're the one driving the story. Breath of the Wild is very much the same way. Right at the beginning of the game, you're given a little info about what happened 100 years ago and gently pushed in the direction of the next plot point in Kakariko Village. From there, you're sent to the four corners of Hyrule to free the divine beasts so that they can help you blast Ganon. Beyond the execution of these four tasks, which you could call the plot of the game, the series of events that lead you to the end credits, the story is told in three main ways. The first one is the traditional one, cutscenes, mainly the ones that you get when you talk to old Manny McKinghost and Impa. These fill you in on the basics. 100 years ago, Ganon was gonna kill everyone, so the people dug up all these cool old robots to fight him with, but then he turned all the robots against them, and Zelda had to trap the old mania in Hyrule Castle. Link was hurt at some point and put in a weirdo chamber with only his undies, and that's how stuff got started. These scripted bits are very few, mostly just at the start of the game when you talk to these characters, but they contain some flashes of very great awesomeness. Some of the shots of the Guardians destroying villages are just terrifying, very exciting stuff. But like I said, there aren't a lot of these, and as such, they leave a lot to be desired, but I'll come back to them later. The second way the game tells its story is the most passive. It's through the accounts told by the game's characters and through observation of the world, through talking to all the various NPCs and completing quests, and even looking at all the ruins and such scattered across the landscape, you start to further piece together what happened to Hyrule. One excellent example of this passive storytelling is finding the diaries of the princess and the king in Hyrule Castle, as these also offer character development. The third way is the most important, and it's something of a mix between the two other ways, tracking down Link's memories. First off, can I just say that I adored doing this. With a world so huge, trying to find specific spots based on the pictures someone gave me was loads of fun. Some of them required closely looking at the landscape to try and ascertain where they might have been taken. The real point is, though, this is a perfect way to tell a story in a huge open world. This is a terrific way for the player to take it in at their own pace, and it also gives them that sense of accomplishment I was talking about. You're not just told the story here, you earn it. These memories fill us in on what went down 100 years ago, and also act as something of a puzzle and a collectible. They are very naturally married to gameplay and to pure exploration. In broad terms, this all sets up what might just be the best story in Zelda history. For starters, this Ganon isn't your run-of-the-mill Ganon. He's given up on resurrection and reincarnation and has assumed a mindless, enraged spirit form. This might be the biggest Ganon development since he first turned into a giant pig. It's a unique and very fitting take on the villain, and I think it's incredibly cool. Then the idea that the people of Hyrule dug up all these crazy robot things from a fight with Ganon thousands and thousands of years before, that's just great. The game gives a sense of history that we've never seen in any other Zelda game and really drives home the idea of a cyclical Zelda universe as established in Skyward Sword. In fact, it offers a pretty mind-blowing revelation. Up until now, every Zelda game has fit on one of the branches of the timeline, but this game references events from multiple timelines. That should be impossible, until you realize that this game could take place so far in the future that some of these events have repeated themselves, that in a land doomed to repeat a cycle of war for eternity over a long enough time, any number of events can by complete coincidence happen the exact same way. Maybe Breath of the Wild isn't set thousands of years in the future, but millions. What if we can't even fathom how long this cycle has been repeating, so of course this branch of the timeline had its own Wind Waker and its own Twilight Princess at some point, and this was crazy to realize. Then the whole idea that the world was all but destroyed by Ganon and now its people are basically living in the rubble, that what we're seeing is a ruined Hyrule that was once supremely glorious? That's incredible stuff. Breath of the Wild's story setup is refreshing, it's bold, it's exciting, it's thought-provoking, it's beautiful, it's more than I could ever ask for in a Zelda game. But here's where things start to fall apart. Despite having a perfect format for telling its story, and despite having a terrific foundation for a story, the overall story that Breath of the Wild ends up telling in the form of a plot is sorely lacking. The problem appears to be a lack of effort on the part of the dev team, whether because of a lack of ideas or simply a lack of time. These memory cutscenes, which are the lifeblood of the game's story, just don't tell us much of anything. They don't reveal any important details or show us any of the exciting events the game refers to constantly. Basically, they all just boil down to lightly touching on, again and again, the basic concept of Zelda and the Four Champions. They were hired to pilot the Divine Beasts, and Zelda's supposed to do something with her magic god powers or the Triforce or whatever to stop Ganon, but she can't figure out how to do it. Like, that's it. That's all these cutscenes ever say. One will be like, gee, Zelda's been praying up on the mountain a long time, I hope she could figure out how to use her powers, and another will be like, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to use my powers, and the next one will be like, yes, we have our Divine Beasts, but Zelda still needs to figure out how to use her powers. They all just involve the characters sitting around and talking to each other. There's no development, like ever. Breath of the Wild's story is all about living in the aftermath of a bunch of crazy stuff that went down, but it's a little too lazy to actually show you any of it. Any part of the greater story that can't be told through a group of people talking to each other has a slim chance of actually being shown to the player. I mean, look at one of the last memories you unlock. The whole game, we're told that Link suffered a mortal blow, which was why he had to be put in the regeneration chamber for 100 years. And I'm thinking, man, can you imagine the battle that could actually kill Link, like canonically kill Link? The blow must have come from Ganon himself. It must have been the most epic showdown in all of Zelda history. The whole time I'm just so intrigued by the idea. My imagination is running wild with it. Then it finally happens. I unlock a memory that shows me what really happened all those years ago. And the memory shows Link, already wounded, falling on the ground. Zelda saves him from some guardians with her powers, and this is actually some of the best we get from these memories. This is a little bit of action, but then that's it. Nothing of the fight that actually wounded him, and I guess it was just some guardian or other monster that did it. I don't know, maybe a bokoblin. Nothing about Zelda's eventual confrontation with Ganon, which is another thing I've been wondering about all this time. We don't even get to see the champions getting killed. I mean, not that I'm super into watching Zelda characters get killed, obviously, but that would have been some great cutscenage. Actually getting to see them all in action, fighting, doing what they've been talking about doing for the whole game, instead of just sitting around and having a chat. I'll swing back around to the story when it's time to go over the ending, but right now this is a perfect time to talk more about those characters. This is another huge missed opportunity. I've always felt that Zelda games didn't do enough to utilize its various races. I've always been fascinated by the Zora and the Gorons especially, and I've wanted them to have bigger roles to play. On the surface, Breath of the Wild is everything I've ever wanted. The races all have a real place in the world, and that's great. These champions were all chosen to represent their races because they're the baddest dudes around. They're awesome warriors, and their designs are really cool, and they're gonna pilot giant magical robots so they can fight Ganon? Like, holy cow, that's the coolest thing ever! We've got a Goron and a Zora and a Rito and a Gerudo, and they're this super tight team, and they're actual characters! But sadly, none of this is fully realized. Uneventful and borderline lazy cutscenes would have been easier to swallow if the writers had at least taken the opportunity to develop the game's characters, but they just didn't. Too often we're told about how awesome these champion guys are, but we're never shown, and that's storytelling 101. We never get to see them fight, or work as a team, or do anything with their divine beast beyond hitting the big red button to line up the shot at Ganon at the end. By the end of the game, there's still nothing more than these broad anime archetypes that you understand fully within the first 2 seconds of each one talking. And yes, the Champions Ballad DLC does help a tiny little bit in this regard, but still not nearly enough. And plus, rounding out your characters is something that needs to be done in the main game. I'm not normally so critical when it comes to Zelda characters. The thing about Nintendo is that, at least from how it looks where I'm sitting, they don't seem to hire writers the same way that other companies do. They don't track down novelists and screenplay writers to help them develop their stories and characters and write dialogue. They seem to do all that stuff internally. The designers just seem to kind of work out the stories on their own. And I could be totally wrong on this front, but that's the way it feels. That's why the stories and the characters, while often pretty good, are rarely more than just that. They have a bigger impact on me because I love the series and the universe so much that I think I'm a little more forgiving, but if I'm honest, it's never great. Without the great gameplay to back it all up, Zelda stories are relatively blah. Gameplay comes first, story comes second. That's just how Zelda is. The thing about Breath of the Wild is that it had so much potential in this regard that I found it harder to forgive the mediocre story and characters. The champions and their whole thing, it's just so cool. So when none of it really panned out by the end of the game, I found myself pretty irked. It's a major weakness in an otherwise phenomenal game, and it just feels like they could have done at least a little more quite easily. Like I said, the way it tells its story doesn't just feel minimal, it feels lazy. I know it's fairly time-consuming to animate a cutscene and all that, but this is Zelda we're talking about. These are probably Nintendo's biggest games in terms of production values. Plus, I know a lot of the development time went into building the world and the physics, so the story probably came pretty late in the cycle, but the game was also delayed quite a bit so that it could land on Switch at launch. It's hard for me to believe that they couldn't have fit in a little more interesting story stuff in that time. I can't shake the feeling that they didn't do more because they didn't have to do more. They knew they had the biggest, best Zelda game ever on their hands, so what did the story matter? Again, I could be wrong, but that's how it feels sometimes. To the game's credit, not all is completely lost in the character department. While we don't see enough of her for her character to really develop per se, I do like this game's take on Princess Zelda. We've seen her bounce back and forth between younger and more lively and older and more serious, but this one's fairly unique. She's an older teen / young adult, and she's very science-minded. Her father keeps pressuring her to wake up her powers, since many feel this is the only way they can possibly beat Ganon, but since she can't seem to get the hang of it, she wants to spend most of her time studying the Guardians and the Sheikah Slate. In fact, this rare presence of the King of Hyrule is much of what gives her her character. So far, we've only ever seen the king in Wind Waker, and this time around, he's actually like, Zelda's dad, the king and the princess. He sorta had the same role in Skyward Sword, but he was hardly a king at that point, really more of a mayor or something. Like less of a king and more just Zelda's dad. But this feels like a new dynamic, and the conflict it causes drives her character. Because of all this, she's definitely a highlight in a game that otherwise doesn't do much work to establish or develop its characters. I also really like how they handled Link this time around. As a character, he's still a big hunk of nothing, as I'm sure he'll always be, and hey, I'm fine with that. But I like that his origins are different here. We aren't with Link as he wakes up in a small village somewhere, and we don't lead him to his destiny to be the great hero of Hyrule. He already is the hero. This Link has a history with the other characters. He was actually a trained knight working for the royal family. This not only gives us an actual reason for him being so good at fighting already, but it also enables a lot of unique character interactions. The main characters know him already, so there's less of that, oh, you're wearing green clothes, you must be the hero, that's been done to death by now. And really, just the fact that he has a background makes him feel like more of a real person. I don't mind Link being the voiceless avatar, but it's just nice that they did something different with him in this game. They made him a little more real. Before we move on, I do want to mention the voice acting. I technically should have put this in the part of my review on sound design, but I think I'd like to talk about it here while I'm going over the game's characterization. As you know, this was the first Zelda game with voice acting beyond a few words shouted by fairies, stuff like that. And now that we've experienced it, I think I can officially say Zelda does not need voice acting. It did absolutely nothing for the game. I will be fair though, part of the problem is that this was a half-hearted effort. Only the major cutscenes are voice acted, and the entire rest of the game is done with the usual text. It's not a crime or anything for a game to feature voice acting and supplement it with text, but in this case there's little enough of it that I fail to see the point. And in fact, the transition from one to the other often feels a little jarring, almost like it was added as an afterthought. It also doesn't help that the mouths weren't reanimated to fit the English dialogue, and that none of the voice work is particularly good. I mean, none of it's terrible, but it's dripping with cheese for the most part. Very silly and not very well fitting. It's one of those things where it's like, if you're gonna do it right. Try to get actors for most, if not all, of the dialogue. Yeah, I know that idea is pretty daunting, but it's another one of those things that other big studios do all the time. And work really hard to get some top-notch actors while you're at it. Another thing that's tricky, but can be done. People do it. Otherwise, just don't bother. And again, for the record, I'm still fine with them not bothering. I've never felt that Zelda needed voice acting, and bad voice acting messes up the feel of games often enough that I think I'd just rather not even take the risk with my Zeldas. They're too important to me. So, now that we've done it, we've seen how it works. If Nintendo wants to put this little experiment behind them in the future, I'll be perfectly fine with that. Their call though, I guess. So now we come to the low point of a section of this review that's already been pretty darn critical. That ending. It's bad, folks. Real bad. I had heard from multiple sources that it was bad, and even with low expectations, it still managed to disappoint me. But let's go at it from the beginning. You climb Hyrule Castle and find this big Ganon monster in a weird cocoon, which I actually thought was really weird and surprising and cool. He comes out and it's an actual boss battle, which is great because the rest of the game doesn't really have a lot of good boss battles, which is something we'll touch on later. After this is the obligatory final form section that's pretty much series standard at this point. It's a trope, but you know what? It's a trope I like. A lot of people didn't like this section because it's kind of shoehorned in there, and there's no real challenge to it. You just ride around popping off arrows, and there's like no chance he can ever hit you with his big zappy attack. It's purely for show, just to give you one last exciting little cinematic thing right at the end of the game. And it's totally silly, but I like that. I was gonna be pretty disappointed if the first form was the only one, so I enjoyed the whole light arrow thing, especially with the extra cool slash silly move right at the end where you fly up on the gust from the fire and hit him right in the head. It's just fun. But it's what comes next that I have a serious problem with, because what comes next is the worst possible thing they could have put at the end of the biggest, coolest Zelda game ever. Nothing. Okay, before we really get into this, first, let me tell you a little story. It's called The Ending of Ocarina of Time, the first 3D Zelda game ever on hardware that's super old now, way back when developers were used to spending a lot less time and money on their games. Link beats Ganon, and the sages seal him in the Dark Realm. The job done, Zelda then returns Link to his own time so that he can live his full life. After that, we're treated to one of those end credit sequences where the camera just sort of pans around the game's locations. A relatively cheap method, I'll admit, but an effective one as it reminds us of all the different stages of our journey. Also, we can see that these places are completely empty of people. Then we see a bonfire and soon learn that all the different races of Hyrule have come together to have a great big party celebrating the end of Ganondorf's reign of terror. We get to see all these characters from the game chilling together and having a good time. Then we see the sages watching over them and they fly away. And shortly after, we come to the pedestal of time where Link has just replaced the Master Sword, creating an entire new timeline in the process, I'll note. Then his fairy companion flies away, which will directly lead into the events of the game's sequel. After a false ending, finally we come to Zelda's little garden, where Link walks up to her. Does she remember everything that just happened? Is a Ganondorf from this earlier timeline perhaps on the other side of that window? What will they say to each other? It's a mystery, for that is where this story concludes. That is an ending. Now let's take a look at Breath of the Wild's ending. Link beats Ganon and Zelda pops out and finishes him off. Then she asks Link if he really remembers her, and they look at Hyrule Castle as the king and the champions look down on them. Roll credits. Black background with a handful of static snapshots from the game's cutscenes. That's the ending. Thanks for playing, I guess. Whoa. Okay, that's not the whole ending, I'll admit. You got me. If you unlocked all the memories and freed all the divine beasts, and really, who didn't do that before fighting Ganon, you get the real secret ending after the credits. Here, Zelda talks to Link about how they can rebuild Hyrule. She makes a little reference to hearing Fi in the Master Sword, and that's a nice little nod to Skyward Sword. You've got to be kidding me. I can't even necessarily call Breath of the Wild's ending bad. Bad suggests a certain lack of quality in something, but how can something be bad if it doesn't exist? This is an ending only in the sense that it's where the game stops, but it certainly doesn't conclude anything more than the most obvious Link must beat bad man conflict. The bland laziness present in Link's memories is at its most ludicrous in the ending. I mean, this is the ending. You couldn't spare just a little bit more effort to leave us feeling satisfied? We want to know what really happened after Ganon was defeated. How did the people of Hyrule feel? What did Impa and the Sheikah have to say about all this? How did Zelda go about restoring Hyrule Castle and reassembling the royal family's forces? What did they end up doing with the divine beasts? Give us something, anything. And I really wasn't looking for a ton here. A very small amount of effort would have gone a very long way, even if it was just a few little animated bits that showed us what the characters got up to after Link beat Ganon, like we saw in Twilight Princess. Just something. Anything other than nothing. Unfortunately, I can't say the ending doesn't fit with the rest of the game. It's a fitting end to a plot that doesn't really do much. It's a fitting cutscene in a series of cutscenes where nothing happens. Again, the obvious potential of the game and the strength of its concept are what make all this so hard to forgive. It feels like this could have been the best Zelda story 10 times over, a true evolution of Zelda and storytelling, a series shift just as large and important as the overhauled gameplay. Also, I usually try not to let trailers get my expectations up too high, and I try not to necessarily judge games based on how I thought they would be because of the trailers, and I instead judge them, by their own merits. But I will say, this game tricked me. The trailers for Breath of the Wild pulled snippets from every little exciting bit in the game and gave a very wrong impression of how it would ultimately be. And I know that's what all trailers do to some extent, but this took it too far. In the main trailer, we saw legions of guardians laying waste to Hyrule. We saw a giant, horrific spirit Ganon swirling around Hyrule Castle. We saw Link embracing Zelda as she collapsed, weeping in the rain. We heard parts from all these exciting monologues and saw all this crazy stuff happening. And I personally thought, holy cow, some crazy stuff happens in this Zelda. This is like a big action movie. But then I got the game and saw that no, that stuff in the trailer was basically it. The trailer just took bits from the very small pool of exciting stuff the game actually has to offer. And like I said, that probably shouldn't affect how I view the game now, but I have to admit there's a tiny little part of me that's still pretty miffed about it. At this point though, what's done is unfortunately done. The game's secrets have been thoroughly plumbed and the DLC ended up doing little to improve the game's story and characters. But at the very least, we can all hope that maybe it really was just a lack of time and that Breath of the Wild will eventually get its very own Majora's Mask equivalent. Hopefully the next time the Zelda team has a great new idea for a story, they're given the proper time to develop it into something that lives up to Zelda's pedigree. Breath of the Wild is without a doubt the most difficult 3D Zelda, and probably the most difficult Zelda period since the first two games on NES. And when I say difficult, I don't necessarily mean it's hard to figure out or has hard puzzles, I mean it kills you a lot. Difficult in the sense that stuff makes you die more than in other Zeldas, in combat and out. I mean, 3D Zelda games in particular haven't traditionally provided much challenge in the past. Majora's Mask required a lot of careful planning and time management, and Skyward Sword could be hard as heck when the motion controls weren't working properly, but really, combat has for the most part been really easy, with hearts aplenty. The addition of Hero Mode has certainly helped in this regard, but in most games, unless you're facing a ton of foes all at once, it's a simple matter of protecting yourself and striking when you get the chance, or using an item to open the baddie up. Taking damage comes less from a difficult fight and more from a lack of patience and a desire to just swing your sword like crazy. Breath of the Wild takes the series in a whole new direction. Firstly, it's interesting to note that it's the only Zelda game where it starts gets hard and only gets easier the longer you play. Like when you boot it up and you don't have anything and you don't know what you're doing, it is hard as heck. But the more you play and the stronger you get, the easier it is to navigate until you reach a point where you can blast through every baddie you come across. There's a slight element of easier as you go in other Zelda games only because when you start a file, you've usually only got 3 hearts, meaning you can only take a few hits even from little guys. Once you get a few extras, it becomes easier in a sense, though of course the challenges and the baddies do ramp up as you go, as is traditional. In Breath of the Wild though, if you take your time like I did, it really does just get easier the whole way through, even with baddies ramping up. I'm getting a little ahead of myself though, I'll talk more about progression in a bit. Right now I want to focus on that more difficult early stage of the experience. I'm talking about the Great Plateau, where the game starts. When you wake up, you're given some clothes that offer very little protection and you're spat out into the world. And considering some Zelda games are infamous for having hours-long opening sections where you've got to do loads and loads of busy work before you can even get a sword, Twilight Princess, anyone? The Great Plateau slaps you right in the face with the realization that this ain't the Zelda you're used to, son. There's no hand-holding here. We ain't giving you nothing. If you want to do something, you gotta figure out how to do it, and you've got to be good enough to do it. No Master Sword, and not even so much as a wooden practice sword. Nope, you just start out picking up sticks and hitting monsters with them. If you want better weapons, then you have to win them or steal them from those monsters, or if you're lucky, find them hidden in chests. Then of course you find that all weapons break after a while. Here at the beginning of the game, sometimes after only a few hits. So this keeps you moving, fighting to earn enough weapons to protect yourself with. Again, weapon breakage is something I'll talk more about in a bit. There's so much to all this that it's really hard not to get ahead of myself. But anyway, one really big thing that makes the game harder at this early stage is the complete and utter lack of recovery hearts. You don't get them from downed enemies, you don't get them from grass or pots, you can't find them anywhere. They don't exist in this game. This is the case in the hero modes from previous games, but this time it's like that right in the base experience. If you want to heal, you've got to gather food and eat it. Nothing responds either, at least not this early. For me, Blood Moons came much later. When you pick up an apple and eat it, it's gone. And it's not like there isn't enough food on the Great Plateau, but it's certainly not something you can farm infinitely or find instantly no matter where you are. This gives you a real, actual need to be careful, and when you make a mistake and get hurt, you've got to work to make yourself well again. And that happens a lot because, like I said, this game likes to kill you. There was a really big moment for me within maybe the first half hour of the game. I was wandering around and came to a cliff. I wanted to know what was at the bottom of the cliff, so I did what I would do in any Zelda game. I jumped off, and I died. And I was like, oh, that's what kind of game this is. All at once, I understood. I realized that it wasn't gonna baby me like the other Zeldas. I wasn't some indestructible superhero. I actually had to try, like a real person would. And that was just incredible to me. It was such a huge revelation. It was invigorating. It's pretty funny splatting off a high cliff and having such a big whoa moment. It should be obvious that when you jump off a cliff, you go splat, but this was such a new thing for Zelda, and it said something. I knew from that moment on that this game would require a lot more of me, and I would go on to discover that, yeah, I was right to think that. Another big moment was when I figured out how to cook, which you might have heard me talk about in my first impressions video way back when. The game does tell you how to perform all your basic actions, but some of the deeper stuff is harder to figure out. The mysterious old man can be found in a few different places, and he gives you some pointers, but probably like many people, it was a good while before I found his cabin, which is where the game gives you a little rundown on cooking. Here's how it went with me. I wanted to go up the snowy mountain to reach one of the shrines, but I couldn't because it was so cold that I constantly took damage. This was another really big revelation of how harsh the world could be. So I fell back a ways to this very conveniently placed enemy camp. After clearing out the enemies, I found these peppers that claimed to help fend off the cold. Thing was, just eating them raw didn't seem to work, and there didn't seem to be an option in the menu to combine them into dishes. There was a cooking pot in the camp, so I figured, okay, maybe I need to cook them in this pot. But again, there was no command for it popping up, so I thought, well, maybe it needs fire. It felt like a long shot that any of this would work, but I jabbed the nearby campfire with a spear, and sure enough, it caught, and then I jabbed the pot, and sure enough, it lit that fire. I still couldn't get it to work though, and I kept thinking I must have needed the ghost guy to tell me how to cook before I could do it, or give me a special spoon or something that let me do it. But then I was playing around in the menus again when I saw that I could hold items. I didn't know exactly what that would accomplish, but I soon found that I could hold multiple items at once. Then, there was my command! I had to hold the ingredients and chuck them into the pot myself. So I mixed my peppers with some other stuff and made a potion that let me push into the cold area, and that whole experience was immeasurably rewarding. Especially after playing a game where on one of the last dungeons in the whole thing, your companion has to stop everything to remind you that you can shoot arrows to hit switches. This was just incredible. The game didn't hold my hand. It didn't explicitly tell me what to do and why I should do it. It didn't halt my progress until I jumped through the right hoop. Despite the fact that I missed the place where it would have taught me in a more direct manner, it gently and naturally led me to learn all this myself. It presented me with a need, then gave me the tools to figure out how to meet that need. And golly gee, you know what they call that? Good game design. And really, the whole plateau is like this. It's intricately crafted to teach you nearly everything you need to know about the game. It technically is a starting area that you can't escape unless you complete certain tasks, but it never feels that way. It's only a tiny chunk of the map, but it still feels massive, especially the first time. It's so big that I didn't mind exploring it one bit. I spent hours and hours on it before moving on. That's a tutorial right there. That's a tutorial done right. It shows you rather than just telling you. It teaches you how cruel the world can be, but also how you can get by. You want to learn because learning is necessary to survive, and never has Zelda offered us such a compelling world to explore and survive in. Back to difficulty though, one thing that makes this game the most challenging 3D Zelda yet is naturally the combat. Like I said, combat up until now has been fairly straightforward, and as long as you were patient, you wouldn't take much or any damage. Skyward Sword was definitely different. It required properly executed motion-controlled strikes in specific directions, and just swinging your sword around wildly wouldn't get you anywhere. I can sort of applaud this aspect of it, but I think the overall execution was lacking. I want my fighting to actually take effort, though not the kind of effort that makes my arms tired and makes the game significantly less comfortable to play. Also, no matter what game you're talking about, motion controls will never be 100% reliable, and the game doing one thing while you're trying to tell it to do another is never fun or fair. But as it does with many, many things that previous Zeldas attempted, Breath of the Wild takes the idea of more challenging and engaging combat and really nails it. And it's hard to pin down exactly what is so much better about it. It just feels so much less mechanical and exploitable than it used to. There's a very natural feel to it. Instead of finding ways to open baddies up to attack as though they're puzzles, it's about just killing them. Finding a way to do enough damage that they die from it. When you counter an enemy, it's not because the A button went ba-da-dip and told you it was time to counter. When you counter an enemy, it's because you avoided their attack and followed up with your own, like a counter works. There's so many ways to go about fighting and so many moves you can do, especially when you consider the runes and all the environmental stuff. If you take out your bow while you're in the air, you can slow down time and take better aim. This alone opens up an enormous amount of options, and most importantly is just really cool. It's just really fun and empowering to pull off. It makes you feel really awesome doing all these rad matrix shots all over the place. Successful parries are your reward for learning your enemy well and honing your reaction time. Then there are flurry rushes to try and pull off, and these can be pretty tricky too. There are times when you'll set one off without much effort, but other times it just won't seem to work right. There's just a lot to combat this time around. It's so much more complex than it's ever been. In fact, I've put over 200 hours into the game and I still don't feel like I've mastered the combat. I still find myself struggling sometimes when I'm fighting a big baddie without using any tricks like runes or bomb arrows, getting walloped while I try and fail again and again to dodge an attack and get my rush. One of the biggest changes though is that unless you're strong enough to take them out in a couple hits, even the smallest guys won't let you just sit there and wail on them like past baddies. They'll block your attacks, which will damage your weapon, and unless you're able to knock their shield out of the way, they'll inevitably hit you back. And if they're wailing on you, naturally you can't just sit there and block everything either. Your shield is just as likely to break as your sword. It's just so much harder this time around to completely incapacitate monsters. So if there happen to be a lot of them around, fighting becomes something you've really got to think about. The name of the game is strategy. You can't always just launch yourself into any situation or you're likely to get your clock cleaned. You've got to practice fighting, know your enemy, make sure you've got enough firepower to last you through the battle, and in many cases, try your best to deal as much damage as you can before your foes have even spotted you. And speaking of breakable weapons and shields, this is something that I was initially a little worried about, but I soon saw how much it improved the game. Once more, this will all sound familiar to you if you've watched my video in defense of Breath of the Wild's brittle weapons, but seeing as this is a comprehensive review, I'd like to go over it again. And I know that this is a very hot-button topic. There are people very firmly on both sides of the fence. But here's the way I see it, at least. Breakable weapons and shields limit the player. Like I said, they're one thing that makes the game so challenging, especially at first. The ability to attack in Breath of the Wild is no longer something you can take for granted. It's a resource. It's something that can be depleted and needs to be actively maintained. And early on in the game, this basically forced me to learn how to fight and learn all the different ways that I could kill baddies. I had to learn how to sneak and execute stealth kills, or utilize rolling boulders and exploding barrels. I had to use whatever weapons I found, which led me to learn how to use the different weapon types, which I then discovered were useful in different situations. I learned the importance of a well-aimed arrow, and when to use a spear versus a sword, and how to effectively throw nearly broken weapons for critical damage. Critics of this breakage system usually cite two primary issues that they have with it, and I'll address them here. First, they don't like that the game forces them to do anything. They feel that in an open-world game that offers a great sense of freedom as a selling point, no single mechanic should be thrust upon them, and if they want to use a single one-hander the whole game, they should be able to do just that. And I kind of see where they're coming from here, but I just can't agree. Being limited and disadvantaged is one of the things that makes Breath of the Wild so refreshing and unique. Do you really want to just play the same old Zelda where you go around trouncing every single guy you come across? Because that's what it would be like if you had even one decent unbreakable sword at the very beginning. It would completely destroy the very delicate balance of difficulty that the Zelda team crafted here. Encouraging you to adapt and try new things is a very deliberate design choice that helps distinguish the game from past entries, and all that would go out the window if your weapons didn't break. Plus, it only forces you to explore other avenues of fighting at the very beginning. Once you really get rolling, the game throws enough weapons at you that you've got a lot of freedom and can kill baddies however you want. At the absolute worst, you'll be annoyed that you've got to use a spear because you ran out of one-handers, but you certainly don't have to keep sneaking and shooting and magnesising if you don't want to. Secondly, they don't like how the weapons break so darn quickly because the threat of losing a good weapon makes them not want to ever use it. And in the beginning, I will admit that the weapons do break absurdly fast. This is the game teaching you how to play and offering you an incentive to keep adventuring for better and better stuff. But again, as you move through the game, they start lasting longer and longer, and you gain access to more and more of them. It is not long at all before you've got more weapons than you know what to do with. So people who don't want to use their weapons, I don't normally like the get over it attitude when it comes to gaming. I truly believe that most, if not all, opinions are valid opinions. If you feel something about a certain aspect of a game, then that's just how you feel. We all have wildly differing tastes. But in this particular case, you gotta get over it, man. This is completely a hang-up that I understand, and in fact, I even feel it myself in this game sometimes, but it's one that you just have to get around. You just have to ignore, because it doesn't make any sense. Using your low-level weapons because you don't want to waste your best ones will slow down your progress toward getting more great weapons. Like, you will overall have more higher-level stuff if you just use your stuff and get through those baddies faster. Later in the game, Hyrule throws more awesome swords at you than you know what to do with. This little hang-up is too silly a thing to spoil the whole experience because it's not even a thing. It's not even a real problem. It's an imaginary one. When in doubt, just use it. You will always get another one later. Suffice it to say, I love the breakage system. I love how it led me to really learn how to play the game, and on a more kinda dumb video gamey level, I love the constant satisfaction of finding cool stuff. I'm constantly like, oh cool, another Lionel sword. Ooh, look at the bonus on this Guardian Spear plus. Oh yeah, some shiny new shields. As long as I keep moving forward and smashing everything I pick up over the heads of my foes in that intensely satisfying way, I'll always be stupidly pleased to find even more stuff to smash over the heads of my foes. It's a very effective feedback loop. Swinging back around to difficulty one final time, because sometimes I'm terrible at structuring my reviews, I want to talk about one more element of Breath of the Wild that really blew me away, that really hit home that this was a very different Zelda game. See, I never stumbled upon the Stone Talus on the Great Plateau, but the Zelda team did very cleverly place one right along the path to Kakariko Village, just in case. I ran into this one, and this was obviously my greatest challenge yet. The thing was just massive, and since I had so few hearts and such lame armor, it could squish me in one hit. Yeah, a Zelda game with an enemy that could one-shot me. This was really happening. I fought the thing for ages, reloading my save again and again, learning its moves and stunning it and using up all my weapons trying to bring it down. And I'm sure plenty of other people have figured out ways to beat these things with nothing more than a mop and a Korok leaf or something, but not me. I reached a point where I just looked at it and went, I'm not strong enough to beat this thing. I'm playing a Zelda game and fighting a boss, and I'm just not good enough at fighting, nor do I have enough equipment to bring this thing down. I don't have enough hearts, and my swords aren't strong enough to do the job. So I just left. I ran away to Kakariko, and this was huge. This was just so different. It was exhilarating and exciting because moving forward, that stone talus was always in the back of my mind, and I dreamed of the day I would be strong enough to bring it down. And sure enough, I did. I came back later, and it was a great challenge, but after a long struggle, I did it, and it felt awesome. That sense of victory was not only new for Zelda, but also for Nintendo. I'd never felt so accomplished playing any Nintendo title. I'd never felt like I rose to a challenge like that before. This wasn't just getting the hookshot, then going into the boss room and using the hookshot on its big hookshotty butt or whatever. This was a creature that was just plain hard to fight. It was just strong. And they put it in front of me right at the start of the game so that I knew I had something to work toward. It was up to me to get better at fighting and get stronger gear, and whenever I was ready, I could try again. And when I finally beat the thing, that was me beating it, not my hookshot or my bombs or my boomerang, not its big hookshotty butt or its glowy eye or whatever. Yeah, I had tools at my disposal. Yeah, it had a weak spot, but the victory wasn't handed to me. I earned it through my hard work. I think it also has something to do with the fact that this guy was optional. It's one thing to reach a hard enemy in a game and have to try a bunch of times before you can beat it and move forward, but Breath of the Wild's open world with all of its enemies that you can walk up to at any time, it's somehow much more thrilling. Each challenge feels more personal. Each one is your challenge. It's always there, waiting for you to give it another shot. And overcoming a challenge like that is so much more rewarding than overcoming one that you had to overcome in order to beat the game or whatever. It makes a game feel less like just a game and more like your own private adventure. And that stone talus may have been the first big foe to trounce me many times before I could in turn trounce it, but it wasn't the most notable. Climbing up to Shatterback Point to collect 20 shock arrows was an unreal experience. It was the run-in with the stone talus times 10. As I talked about in the section on exploration, the sight of the Lionel terrified me, and of course it wasn't long at all before I discovered that it could kill me dead with one arrow. I fought that thing for probably an hour before I decided I just couldn't do it. I wasn't even coming close to beating the thing. I was barely leaving a scratch on it. So I gave up. Problem was, I still needed those shock arrows. So I was forced to sneak around and collect them, and as I did so, I was scared out of my mind. This was not me sneaking because this was a stealth section and the game demanded that I sneak or else I would get thrown in jail or have to start over or something. This was me sneaking because if the bad guy saw me, it would murder me. And not in a little insta-fail, try again kind of way. No, it would just chase me and hit me until I was dead. And this was terrifically exciting. I know I've been saying it a lot, but again, it didn't feel like something from a Zelda game. It was so different and so much more. Eventually, I gathered up enough arrows, but I vowed to return someday and defeat that beast. That Lionel was my white whale, my new objective, even above freeing the divine beasts and beating Ganon and saving Hyrule. I absolutely had to kill that thing. So I came back every once in a while, and still it managed to overpower me many, many times. But each time I brought its health down a little lower. I lasted a little longer. And one day, finally, after many long hours in the game and many, many attempts, I did it. I climbed that mountain and the fight that ensued was legendary. I probably learned more about combat from that one fight than I did from the entire rest of the game. I learned its moves and how to counter each one. I perfected the timing of my shield parry and wailed on it with a two-hander whenever it was stunned. I felt like an animal. I had fire in my eyes. Not even the hardest Zelda bosses had ever tested my mettle like that or demanded such timing and precision, but everything the game asked, I delivered. I drained that thing's health, and when it finally fell with a roar, I too roared. I raised my fists to the sky in triumph and made my victory known to all who could hear my mighty cry. It was, and still is, the strongest sense of accomplishment I've felt in any Zelda. It was absolutely glorious. Later, I would find different colored Lionels that would strike me with terror and dread all over again. Wait, there's a white one too? But as time went on, I got even stronger and learned how to fight them even better, and now I can make short work of the toughest Lionels out there. Sometimes after a blood moon, when they all respawn, I'll go Lionel hunting just to do it, just to show them who owns Hyrule. And this aspect of the game's difficulty leads us to the next topic, progression. Breath of the Wild does not work like any other Zelda when it comes to progression, because every other Zelda up to this point has largely based its progression on items. Items grant you new abilities, which allow you to reach new areas and beat bosses. That's really Zelda in a nutshell, but Breath of the Wild gives you all of your runes, which are essentially your items, right at the beginning. Once you leave the Great Plateau, you've technically got everything you need to go and complete all the game's major objectives. The entire map is open to you from the start. There is still some sense of progression though. There are a handful of different obstacles that will try to keep you from certain areas, but I'd say the two things the game uses most to gate you off are your combat strength and your stamina meter, i.e. hard monsters and things like tall cliffs or large bodies of water. Since we've been going over difficulty, let's cover the former first. The world is filled with baddies, with difficulty levels denoted by a series of colors. Finding and completing shrines will cause all the baddies in the world to slowly scale up, and from what I can tell, they'll usually scale relative to each other. If you find a place with 2 moblins and a blue moblin, later they might become 2 blue moblins and a black moblin, then later 2 black moblins and a silver moblin. Most Lynels will eventually become silver, though some of the ones that were meant to be easier will stay at lower levels. The outliers here are the Guardians, because they don't seem to scale at all. They're extremely deadly for a lot, if not most of the game, but eventually you get strong enough to take them out with relative ease. This whole scaling system provides a pretty good balance. If every enemy was a static difficulty, then progression would be much more limited. You would basically be forced to only tackle the lower level areas until you'd gotten strong enough to hit the harder areas. Heading anywhere new, it would just come down to luck if you were strong enough to move forward, and of course you would eventually reach some new area and realize that you were supposed to hit it earlier, and look at that, now every single enemy is so laughably weak that it's no fun. But here, the option to go somewhere is pretty much always on the table, and just often enough you'll be blocked by tougher foes to keep things interesting and provide some of that very nice challenge I was talking about. The game provides freedom and challenge in good measures. As I said, Guardians are the only enemies that don't scale. Each one, regardless of its type, lives where it lives and never gets stronger. And I think this is a really important element of the game. If scalable enemies help keep things balanced, these unscalable ones balance it further by selectively turning just some areas of the game into particularly difficult challenges to overcome. There aren't so many Guardians around that you never feel like you can go where you want to, but there are just enough to instill a very thrilling sense of danger and build what are essentially progression gates. But of course, gates that you can hop if you're good enough. Early on, when Guardians could vaporize me with one blast and seemed to have way more HP than I could ever possibly hope to dish out, I was all the more intrigued by the places they guarded. All of Hyrule Castle seemed so mysterious and terrifying, and I never wanted to get close because there were always so many stalkers around it. If a place was patrolled by Skywatchers, I had to hold my breath and sneak around and pray they didn't see me and blow me to smithereens. And whenever I did manage to get past them, it felt like I was going somewhere I wasn't supposed to. If a place is guarded by enemies that are way too strong for me to fight, I must be breaking the system by sneaking in. Oh man, if Ganon catches me here, he's gonna be so mad. The whole idea of every area being open to me for the most part, but some being so much more dangerous than others was really fantastic. Talk about a sense of place. Breath of the Wild's Hyrule feels so much more real because it doesn't feel like the whole thing is fed to you in bits with little choice on your part. You're not totally blocked off from any major areas, but some of them do take a lot of extra work to get to. And of course, as you can guess, it feels awful good when you do get strong enough to just waltz in these tougher areas and cut stalkers to pieces left and right. Whether you're hitting these places early or late, it feels great. It feels like you really earned it. Enemies may scale as you complete shrines, but of course you get stronger as well. The goddess orbs you find in shrines can be exchanged for hearts or extra stamina. Both hearts and stamina feed into your combat ability naturally, either increasing the number of hits you can take or how big of a spin attack you can do and how much you can sprint. Let's talk about stamina next though, because that's the other thing that largely determines where you can and can't go in Breath of the Wild. You can climb just about any surface, which opens up immense exploration possibilities, but if you run out of stamina at any point, you fall. Similarly, it takes stamina to glide with your paraglider or swim across water. This is extremely clever because it means despite the fact that you've technically got all the tools you need to beat the game, your ability to explore is increased directly by exploring. The ability to reach new areas more effectively, or even at all in some cases, comes from reaching new areas, finding and completing as many shrines as you can. It's a very rewarding system and it feels very natural. It gives the world a certain amount of consistency and logic. Sure, you can go anywhere you want, but are you strong enough to climb that cliff? Can you hold on long enough to glide out to that island? And this of course goes hand in hand with the Korok Seed weapon slot system that I talked about in the section on exploration. That's another way in which you're rewarded with more strength the more you explore. The more Koroks you find, the more weapons you can hold, the more damage you can do, the more places you can go. Overall, these elements make running around and doing stuff worth doing. A game this big and open, Nintendo could have easily messed up in this department, creating a huge world to explore but offering little reason to do so or making it so open that it was easy and boring. They pulled it off though. Even without being based on items, Breath of the Wild's progression system is fun and satisfying. It does have a few problems though. The biggest one is that while they did a pretty good job of replacing item-based progression, I don't know if they can ever truly do it. Like, while I obviously enjoy the way Breath of the Wild does progression, there's always that little part of me that misses the old way. I mean, it was at the core of Zelda's identity, just as it is with Metroid, for example, and I can definitely see where people are coming from when they dislike Breath of the Wild for straying too far from the Zelda formula to feel like a Zelda game anymore. I was a little bummed when I first found out that the Great Plateau contained all the quote-unquote items. In the end, the immense freedom and other forms of progression were enough for me to be okay with this new system, but who's to say that moving forward in the series I won't start to miss the old way even more than I do now? Maybe a mix of the two systems would be the best of both worlds? I know it's a delicate process, but I'm pretty sure they could fit at least a little more in there to block the player's path in the future. Just a little. Backtracking for the sake of backtracking isn't exactly fun, especially in a game this big, but at the same time, it's hard to replace the satisfaction of carving your way into new areas because of a new item or ability you found, of having the world open up as you play. But I don't know, I could probably do a whole video just on this topic, so let's move on before we get in over our heads. Another problem I have is how weapons scale. When you beat shrines and get orbs, you get hearts and stamina, and that's great because it's tangible. It means something. You accomplish more, you get stronger. But on top of that, beating shrines makes the loot you find scale up, whether it's being held by foes or hidden in chests. This is actually the primary way that you get stronger, as in the way you raise your attack. You don't gain actual levels, your base attack doesn't go up, you just find better weapons as you go. Your armor rating goes up and you gain other bonuses by acquiring and upgrading armor, but let's save that for another section. This weapon scaling system is obviously to help you keep up with these scaling enemies. Like I said, I like the scaling enemies because they keep the game interesting, otherwise too many areas would be worthlessly easy and boring, but when combined with this weapon scaling, the whole thing starts to feel a little arbitrary. Technically, it is all happening because you're beating shrines, so it's a little like you're leveling up or whatever, but I often stop and think, I wish I was getting stronger. I wish my strength was more about building up my character and less about what weapons the game decides to spawn for me. It's like if it's gonna scale both the enemies and the weapons kinda equally, it might as well give me a rainbow Lionel with 1 billion health and a sword with 10 million attack. It doesn't really matter. It's kind of a false sense of progression in a way. It's not like the whole thing is worthless or anything. It does feel nice to move forward and get stronger, and eventually you get to the point where you dominate everything, which means the baddies and the weapons aren't moving at exactly the same speeds, but I just think they could have come up with a better way for the game to pull you along than just slowly spawning better and better weapons. Even a traditional leveling system with a growing attack stat would have worked really well, especially because that would mean getting XP from enemies, and that would be a dream come true for me. Or hey, maybe you don't need XP. Maybe these spirit orbs could be exchanged for hearts or stamina or attack power. That would make things even more interesting. This system is especially lame when you consider how loot that you find in treasure chests within shrines doesn't scale for whatever reason. And if it doesn't scale, well, of course they don't want to risk you finding weapons way above your level, so for most of the game you're opening chests and just throwing away what you find inside. The special weapons you get from each of the divine beasts, same thing. They're just worthless. Chances are they're not going to be as strong as the other stuff you're getting, at least if you're taking your time with the game, so it kind of feels like, what's the point of even having them? I never used any of the legendary weapons, not even once. My last problem with the progression system is that it's kind of ruined by one of the abilities you get in the game. 2 words, Rivali's Gale. This allows you to fly way up in the air on a big gust of wind, and yeah, you've got a limited amount of gales before you have to recharge, but the weight is really not a big deal. The only reason this move didn't ruin too much of my fun was that I did a substantial amount of the game before heading to see the Rito. Some of the most fun I had in my initial run was trying to scale tall cliffs or figuring out how to traverse extra tricky areas. Akala Tower? Oh man, why couldn't more of the game have been like this? Surrounded by Ganon gunk and rubble? How are you supposed to get up there? A total head scratcher. Then there's Hyrule Castle. I had a ton of fun sneaking in early and trying to figure out how to get to the top. It's that puzzle thing Eiji Aonuma was talking about before the game came out, how in Breath of the Wild you'd be able to go anywhere, but figuring out how to get to some places would be the puzzle. Oh, that's how. Puzzle over. Puzzle solved. Once you get Rivali's Gale, so much of the challenge of traversal is gone in an instant. It's just overpowered. It throws off the wonderful balance of stamina and how it affects your progression entirely. It's the kind of thing that I'm glad exists, because after a while, I do want to just get everywhere I want easily. It's fun to eventually overcome your limitations and work your way up to being godlike in any game, but it's just too easy to get here. Now that I know the move exists, when I start a new playthrough, I'm either going to hit that Divine Beast first and get it first thing, or I'm going to be exploring and constantly wishing I had it, because it's much harder to live without when it's within your grasp and you know how easy it makes everything. The other champion powers are pretty OP too, to be honest, and also managed to negate a lot of great design choices. Seriously? Mipha's Grace? Basically a fairy that recharges and maxes out my health so I don't really have to be careful anymore? Rivali's Gale is the one that comes closest to undermining what the game is trying to achieve, though. One thing that would have solved all OP problems with the champion powers would be to make each power pretty weak from the start and require leveling up. Maybe sometimes when you clear a shrine, in addition to an orb, you get something that makes one of your powers stronger. More height for Rivali's Gale, more hearts for Mipha's Grace, more charges for Daruk's Protection, more power and range for Urbosa's Fury, and how about lower recharge times across the board? I feel this would have helped balance the game, and on top of that, it would have given us even more to work for and feel good about achieving. We would still feel awesome gaining these abilities. Holy cow, I can just shock guys now? Awesome! But they wouldn't throw things out of whack like they do now. All in all, it ain't perfect, nor is it very Zelda-y, but the progression system in Breath of the Wild still works pretty darn well. I would definitely like to see some tweaks and additions in the hypothetical sequel, but I still had a lot of fun with it. Between the stamina system, the scaling, the new levels of challenge, and the weapon breakage, it makes for an incredibly fresh experience. I can easily say that Breath of the Wild is much more engaging and takes much more thought than Zelda's of old. And even if some of that classic Zelda feel was lost along the way, I'm very thankful for what it accomplishes. We've talked a lot about Breath of the Wild's world so far, and some of the stuff you get to do in it, but now let's talk about how you interact with that world as well as how it in turn affects you, starting with a pretty darn important element of a game this large, traversal. Now, the way I see it, apart from, running around, there are two primary methods of traversal that are unique to this game. The first and most impactful is climbing. When I first heard that you could climb stuff in Breath of the Wild, I made all the assumptions you would expect. It's going to require an item, you're only going to be able to climb on certain surfaces, that kind of thing. I was extremely surprised when I booted it up and found that nope, you can climb on basically everything. Every surface, as long as it's not raining, which we'll talk about later. I originally thought that such an ability would allow too much freedom, especially with a world this big. I mean, aren't there at least some areas the developers don't want us getting into? I mean, isn't that like how video games usually are? But no, they did it anyway. They gave us that freedom. And frankly, it's incredible. It really makes you feel like Hyrule is yours. It instills this incredible sense of possibility and gives you constant incentive to go off the beaten path and challenge yourself to reach new places. Traversal itself is now a bigger challenge than it's ever been, and of course that means it's also more fun and rewarding. Early in the game, you look up at a high place and you go, there's no way I can get up there. I'm sure I'll have to come back later. But then you try it, and maybe you have to go at it from a few different angles, or maybe you have to run off and brew up a stamina potion first, but then you just barely make it to the top with the very last sliver of your stamina and you're like, yes, I am the best Zelda man ever! And really that reflects the very new and unique magic of Breath of the Wild and its world. It used to be all about solving puzzles or beating bad guys, but now even just the simple act of getting up onto one of the game's countless cliffs can be an immensely rewarding experience. That all kind of goes out the window once you get Rivali's Gale, but I already complained about that in the section on progression. The second major mode of travel is gliding with the paraglider. This little thing is absolutely genius. The world is so big, but the distance never feels like a barrier. It's never oppressive because you can always just climb up somewhere or warp to a tower and fly really fast in any direction, covering a great distance. It offers yet another huge sense of freedom because you never have to worry about getting down off a cliff or any high place. Once you put in the work to get somewhere high, your payoff is just gliding away, taking a smooth ride to wherever you like. It makes traversal infinitely more fun, and it complements the climbing incredibly well. These two modes combine to make verticality more important than it's ever been in any Zelda game, which makes Hyrule feel even bigger than it already is. If the map is a skillion square miles or whatever, it's that much more when you consider all the surfaces to climb. These abilities would be too useful early in the game if they had no limits, however, so here we have a very clever stamina system. Again, I talked about stamina in the section on progression, but I've got one more point to make about it here while we're talking about traversal specifically. One of the best things about Breath of the Wild is that it takes elements and concepts that were only touched on in other Zeldas and fleshes them out, builds each one into a big part of the whole experience rather than just a little something to make an entry stand out a bit more. We'll talk about the others in a while, but perhaps the most important one is stamina. Skyward Sword introduced the concept of stamina, and if you ask me, it didn't mean much in that game. It offered some more options in combat where you could perform extra big attacks, of course with the risk of running out of stamina and leaving yourself open for a moment. That was pretty cool. But beyond that, it was kinda worthless. If you were climbing up a wall or running up a steep slope or something, there were always stamina fruits along the way so that you didn't run out. If there weren't, then it would be impossible. You would simply not have enough stamina, but there were, so there was no real challenge. It was an interesting idea, and I certainly appreciated that they were trying new things with Skyward Sword, but it was an idea that fell a little flat. Like, they thought it was a good idea and implemented it without making sure they could come up with clever ways to use it first. Breath of the Wild takes the concept of stamina and turns it into an integral part of the experience. It's not just a novelty, something new just for the sake of being new. It's a very natural and logical mechanic. Gliding is also a mechanic that we've seen in past Zeldas. In Wind Waker, you could glide with your Deku Leaf, but it took magic to do so. And it was like, why magic? How does that make sense? He's just holding onto a leaf. But here, oh, right, it takes stamina to hold onto your paraglider as long as you can. Makes perfect sense. Plus, stamina auto-regenerating makes things like gliding and climbing much less restrictive than if they still used magic, for instance. Instead of limiting you, it feels like it empowers you, even if it empowers you by making you feel limited at first. Since traversal has never been more important in a Zelda game, this system keeps you from dominating the terrain right from the get-go. Then thanks to Spirit Orbs, we have this very rewarding progression system where the more you explore, the more you can explore, yada yada yada. So there's technically one more significant way to get around in Breath of the Wild, but unfortunately I just don't feel like it makes much sense. I'm not really sure why they made horses so useless in this game. I mean, the first image we ever saw of it was of Link on a horse. Riding a horse through this big open world with all its beautiful grasslands, it seemed so perfect. It seemed like horses were going to be more useful than they've ever been. But if you ask me, that just ain't the case here. They can get you somewhere in good time, sure, certainly faster than walking, but pretty much never in my journey did I want to just plow through uncharted territory super fast. Especially your first time through, it's impossible to take 3 steps in this game without getting distracted by something and wandering off the beaten path, usually somewhere your horse can't go. And that wouldn't be a problem if you could call your horse, like in, you know, every other Zelda with a horse ever, but you can't. You can whistle for them, which I think is pretty cool. I love how there's a button just for doing it. But this is one of those instances in a game when something is very realistic at the expense of being fun. Imagine how close you would actually have to be for a horse to hear you whistle in real life. That's pretty much how close you have to be for these horses to hear you. Therefore, if you want to use your horse, more than likely you've already wandered too far from it, and your best bet is going to be to skip the whistle and instead head to a stable and have them bring your horse to you. But of course, that wastes a lot of time, and you're just going to end up leaving it behind again anyway. Pretty much no matter where you're at, there's a faster way to get where you're going than to warp to a stable and talk to them and have them call your horse and then set off for your destination. Yes, you do have the ability to magically call your horse from anywhere if you have the magic armor found in the DLC, but 1, I'm trying not to talk about the DLC in this review, and 2, if you have the DLC, you also have a sick motorcycle, so that's something of a moot point. It's totally fine for other forms of travel to be better than riding horses, but this is frustrating for 2 reasons. 1, it would be very easy to make them less worthless. How about letting them hear your whistle as long as you're in the same section of the map, or within a certain radius at the very least? Or maybe they could follow you to a degree. Any of that would make a massive difference. 2, the fact that you can catch your own horses makes the idea of horses so much cooler. Some horses are rarer and better than others, so when you see one, you're like, oh my gosh, look at the solid color on that horse, I wonder what its stats are. Then there's the absolute thrill of trying to sneak up and catch one. And this is another thing that depends on your stamina, which is another stroke of genius. You want a really nice horse? You gotta be strong enough to tame one. Then you can name them and buy different getups for them and have them as your cool animal companions on your adventure. It has the potential to be a supremely awesome part of the game. But with all of these horsey limitations, the entire mechanic kind of goes out the window, for me at least. I mean, it's not like I never, ever use horses. They're fine when it's early in the game and you've explored very little of the map and you want to get to a very specific place and focus super duper hard on not getting too sidetracked, but in my experience, that has not been a very common occurrence. If I'm heading somewhere new, I'm taking my time to explore. And if I'm going somewhere far away that I've already been to, well, that leads us to Warping. In a sense, warping to towers and shrines is an important mode of travel in Breath of the Wild, but it's not exactly a mode of traversal. You can only warp to places you've already been, so it's more about convenience than anything, beyond the fact that you can hit a tower from one side and use its height to glide into the other unexplored side, but you can say that about any high place. However, despite not technically feeling like a mode of traversal, it's still definitely worth mentioning. Just as it was with climbing, I was so happy to start the game and see that I immediately had access to this power. If you find a tower or a shrine, you can warp to it at any time, period. You don't have to wait until partway through the game to unlock the ability, and you're not limited to 5 or 6 warp points. In fact, it's almost too useful. If you're ever in a bind and about to be smushed by some big monster, you can always just bring up your menu and bye-bye. That sort of removes some of the sense of danger in taking risks and picking fights with higher level stuff. However, I really appreciate the convenience of it. Limitations in games are fine, but not being able to warp around easily would definitely hinder my enjoyment. Getting places would be too much of a chore. This way, it's never a problem to return to a place you've already been. Unless you're bothered by the loading screens, which, yeah, they can be a little long, I'll admit. Finally, it feels kinda funny to call shield surfing a mode of traversal because it's more for fun than anything, but we gotta talk about it somewhere, right? It's not as useful or intuitive as gliding, but shield surfing is similar to gliding in that it's very freeing. It's a way to get down from a high place in a very quick and very fun manner. Really, it's a testament to just how aware the designers were of the need for Breath of the Wild's traversal to be constantly enjoyable and offer a lot of variety. I don't think I would have even come up with the idea myself, but its inclusion is just delightful. The world already feels like a big toy sometimes, and shield surfing adds another layer to the fun, brings in another element to keep you playing and experimenting. And really, it does serve one practical purpose. You can't bring a horse into the desert, and there's a lot of sand to cross. Grabbing onto a sand seal and scooting along at high speed is really useful, and I would love to see this idea explored even more in future games. Maybe dragging behind roving enemies and horses? Shield surfing is also interesting because it's another example of something that's been done in a past Zelda game, namely surfing down the snowy mountain in Twilight Princess, that is fully realized and turned into something practical in Breath of the Wild. It's no longer just a mini-game to be played in one specific place. So that's how you interact with Breath of the Wild's terrain, but what about the stuff? Well, let me tell you, there's a whole lot of stuff interacting in this game. Also somewhat new to Breath of the Wild is physics. Now, I say somewhat because obviously previous games have indeed employed physics. It's kind of how games work, but never have they been such an integral part of the game. Nearly every single thing in the world is a free-moving object that can be affected by gravity and wind. Even ingredients and raw materials can be carried around and dumped wherever you please. Bombs can now roll down hills, yet another thing that Skyward Sword sort of touched on, but not to the same extent. Rupees, curiously enough, are really the only things that you don't purposefully pick up by hitting a button, and you come across freestanding ones lying on the ground very rarely, pretty much just when you're harassing Bloopies. Most objects are also destructible. Your weapons and materials and trees and boxes, etc. all can be burned and broken. But all this wasn't put in place just so they could be like, look at these fancy physics, look at all this destructible stuff, isn't this game cutting edge? Breath of the Wild's physics fit the theme that's strengthened by your new traversal abilities. The idea that the world is yours. You have limitless options, you can play however you want to play. That's why when coming up with the runes, they didn't just give us the usual Zelda stuff. No boomerang, no lens of truth, no spinner, no stuff that's mostly good in specific situations used as progression tools. The runes in this game, which act as your quote items, are all about using this physics system to interact with the world in much broader ways, and this is what truly turns Hyrule into your playground. I'll talk a little more about each specific rune in another section, but the possibilities the Zelda team gave us here are staggering. Stasis alone, which not only freezes objects but allows you to hit them to build up their momentum so you can watch them blast off, is a huge game changer. Unfortunately, I'm not nearly as clever as a lot of other people on YouTube, but the stuff you can do with stasis is absurd. Then magnesis is another big one. There are a lot of metal objects out there, and they pretty much just gave us magnesis and said, here, metal objects are now your plaything. Have fun, Magneto! You can use this ability for fun, or fighting, or, of course, for puzzling, which, again, is something we'll talk about later. Sorry, gotta stay on track. Bombs are certainly a Zelda staple, but an explosion is always going to be a very practical and desirable thing. Then there's Cryonis, which might be the least enormously useful out of all the runes if you have to rank them, but it's still a big deal. It's perfect for traversing water, and its applications in puzzle solving are limitless. Even beyond just physics and runes, you've got weather and elemental effects, and this adds another layer of complexity. There was a big whoa moment when I realized just how many different ways the pieces of this game could interact with each other. It was the first time I saw that burning grass created an updraft that could give me a boost with my paraglider. I was just like, what on earth. That's so awesome. The game is filled with random little interactions like that you've just got to discover. Take out an arrow in a hot place. Look at that. You've got a flaming arrow. Just make sure to shoot it or put it away before it burns up. Outside in a thunderstorm, watch out for metal objects getting struck by lightning. Or hey, use magnesis to weaponize the lightning. Got some ice troubles? Any kind of fire will melt it. Campfire, flaming sword, fire arrow, whatever. No spring water or special blue flame needed here. It's raining or your enemy's standing in water? Then your shock arrows will do tons of damage and stun them. Nothing is arbitrary. Nothing works just because you've got an item that says it works and you use it on something that was made to be affected by that item. Everything follows logic. Wood burns, ice melts, water conducts electricity, heat rises. If you're still experimenting with how the game works and you think doing a certain thing will work a certain way, there's a pretty good chance that you're right. Speaking of weather and how it affects you though, real quick, that's stinking rain! Now, I'm very conflicted here. I like the idea of something limiting your ability to climb. In fact, the Zora Wing of the Divine Beast quest just might be the best because of that long and very challenging sequence where you've got to travel up a mountain without climbing at all because of the constant rain. Temporary limitations are good. They make you think differently. They prevent you from being too overpowered all the time. The problem with rain making it next to impossible to climb, though, is that it's one of those things that probably sounded great on paper, but is a whole different story when you actually apply it to the game as a whole. Fun versus realism is a constant issue in game design, and as we discovered with calling horses, just because something is realistic, that doesn't mean it's fun. And in this case, rain messing up your climbing means spending a lot of time just standing around, sometimes waiting minutes and minutes for the rain to stop. That is not fun. No one is gonna think that that is fun. If you can find some covering, you can build a campfire and wait it out, or you can go do something else, but come on, you're here. You wanna do the thing you wanna do, and wouldn't you know it, every single time you're about to climb this specific thing, that rain starts in again. It's not the sort of thing that ruins the game, and of course it's not always a problem, but when it is, it can be a humongous pain. It would be much better if there was some way to eventually thwart it. Maybe you get an item that prevents slipping partway through the game. Maybe the suit bonus for the climbing outfit prevents slipping. Maybe the more stamina you have, the less you slip. Just something. Some way to feel like you eventually overcame the rain. Rivali's Gale does help a lot, but man, it's still just annoying. To swing back around and conclude my point though, between all the elemental effects and runes and everything, you've got yourself a Zelda game that's big on destiny and Ganon thwarting and princess saving and all that like usual, but even removed from all that, also acts as a giant toy box. The physics system and the tools you're given to utilize it change everything, whether it's working through dungeons or damaging enemies or just goofing off and having a good time. It's another thing that keeps the huge world from being bland and boring like too many open worlds in games. It's what gives Hyrule life. No matter where you go or what you do, there's always a new way to go about solving a problem or some new interaction to see. Now let's dip back into what I was talking about earlier though. Stuff that other Zeldas toyed with, but Breath of the Wild fully realizes and fits into its cohesive world. One thing is temperature. Ocarina of Time introduced the idea of being damaged by high temperature areas with Death Mountain Crater and the Fire Temple. If you wanted to hang out in a volcano without your heart slowly draining, you had to go get yourself a red tunic. In Breath of the Wild though, the whole concept is implemented so naturally. You've got a temperature gauge right there on your screen that tells you how close you are to taking damage, and there's no single, the extreme temperature place that hurts you. Every area of Hyrule has a temperature which changes depending on different things, and as you move around, that temperature naturally goes up and down. Get higher in altitude, it tends to go down. Get closer to Death Mountain, it goes up. Gerudo Desert, and I feel this is a stroke of pretty genius design, becomes too hot in the day and too cold at night, like a real desert. Again, it all follows logic rather than being a simple barrier that's overcome by getting the right item. And how you go about protecting yourself against the elements is up to you. You can wear the proper attire, and even then you'll need multiple pieces of the right gear to protect yourself against the most extreme temperatures. Finally getting heat and cold resistant armor felt like a very big moment for me, very empowering. Then you can brew up some elixirs and meals to protect yourself as well, and another satisfying moment for me was learning the difference between very hot and actually on fire, and figuring out how to make the right elixir to get myself up Death Mountain. No, I didn't have to beat the right temple to get the right item to make the game let me up there. I just had to figure out how to do it. then hey, look at that. If it's cold, you can just hold a burning stick or sword, or huddle up next to a bonfire if you want. There's that logic again. Fire is warm. Put fire near body, body warm too. What do you know? Next up, we've got breakage. We already talked about this a lot in a previous section, so I won't get into it here, but suffice it to say, it is another thing that a previous Zelda only touched on. Skyward Sword gave you shields that wore down and broke over time, and you only got an unbreakable shield for beating a boss challenge that was totally dumb and stupid because that game had some dumb and stupid boss battles, but that's way beside the point. Breath of the Wild, your shields and weapons wear down and break after long enough. Now let's talk about stealth. Stealth is one of those things that you take part in very rarely in Zelda games, and only in the cases when those games give you no other choice. You're trying to get somewhere, and there are guys that, for whatever dumb reason, instantly make you lose if they see you. Wind Waker is a great example of this. You lose your sword, so you've got to avoid moblins or else they'll set you on fire and put you in a cell. After you get your sword back, however, stealth goes out the window. There's positively no reason to use it ever again, and in fact, you can't. After that specific sequence, you don't even have the option to hide in barrels anymore. Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks did use stealth to a greater degree. I'll certainly give them credit there, but these were still very specific enemies in very specific circumstances. In Breath of the Wild, however, any enemy is an enemy you can sneak up on. As we discussed before, this game can be challenging, and you can find yourself in the presence of an enemy you have little chance of beating. But you've always got the option to crouch down and hide in the grass and either slink away or close in for a stealth attack. It's extremely awesome that they incorporated stealth kills into a Zelda game. Later on, when you're super strong, it doesn't matter as much, but when you're still pretty weak, sneaking into an enemy camp and taking out each sleeping foe one by one, well, that's something I'm used to doing in an Assassin's Creed game or something, certainly not a Zelda game. And of course, stealth is the perfect way to get a lay of the land and look for chances to take out your enemies without even getting close, usually thanks to exploding barrels that are very strangely yet very conveniently kept around everywhere. And just so there's no frustration in trying to figure out how quiet you're being or what you're accidentally doing that's waking up your enemies, right there on the screen, a little doodad that lets you know at all times. I'm sure I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but once more, stealth here makes sense. It follows logic. Like everything else, the idea is fully realized and it fits in perfectly with the rest of the world. Finally, we come to two older concepts, monster spoils and potions. Wind Waker introduced the idea of getting specific loot from specific monsters, though most of these spoils went towards specific side quests and meant little after those quests were completed. There were a few, however, that could be used to make certain potions if given to the right characters. I never really bothered, seeing as that game is super duper easy and eventually you get some awesome grandma soup that makes all that worthless, but it's good that they tried out the mechanic. Then Skyward Sword, as usual, was at the forefront of pre-Breath of the Wild innovations. You could buy potions, but you could also augment them with all sorts of bugs you found out in the world, making them way more potent. This was really, really awesome at the time, but surprise, surprise, Breath of the Wild takes the idea and makes it really work. First off, now instead of taking your bugs and stuff to a guy and spending rupees to get them all blended together, you brew your own potions, which, funny enough, in this game are called elixirs. There are critters all over Hyrule, grasshoppers, butterflies, that kind of stuff, and to make elixirs, you mix those critters with monster parts. Then in addition to elixirs, you can cook meals with all sorts of edible stuff you find everywhere, whether it's mushrooms or meat or fruit or whatever. And I gotta say, this whole system is quite in-depth. There are so many ingredients to find in the world, and there's no inventory limit, so you can hoard everything you come across. Each ingredient does something, and mixing them all together can create meals and potions that heal you or make you stronger or make you faster or protect you from the elements like we talked about earlier. Elixirs in particular use a fairly complicated system of buffs where each individual element either adds or strengthens an effect. It took me a while to pick up on the fact that food cannot be mixed with monster parts or critters, and also to learn which animals are critters and which are food, so I do wish they were all better separated or classified or something. But after I learned how it worked, it was fun to experiment. Fun to just start throwing stuff into a cookpot and see what comes out. There's always a chance for your recipe or elixir to gain a random additional effect, so there's that little thrill when the music rises up and you know you got something extra good. In addition to elixirs, monster parts and critters can be used to upgrade your armor. Skyward Sword sort of almost used this idea. You collected materials and used them to upgrade your items and shields, sure, But that was pretty different, and honestly, in this case, I can't even necessarily say that that was an inferior version of what we've got in Breath of the Wild. It was pretty different, and actually kind of great. Upgrading your major progression items was quite novel. This time around, it's all about armor, or gear. You can find this gear out in the world, or buy it from shops, and the whole system adds a lot to Zelda. We've just seen Link in his green tunic so many times that it's refreshing to have all these other options. Style is a big element here, for sure, but much more important are the effects that gear can bestow upon you. Naturally, different pieces raise your defense stat different amounts, and can I say real quick, I love how we've got clear attack and defense stats for the first time in this game. Also, just about anything that a meal or an elixir can do for you, gear can do for you. Wait a minute though, wait. Did you just say you can use the stuff you collect to upgrade your gear? Well, howdy doody hot dog! Gathering stuff to upgrade stuff is one of Arlo's favorite things. You take your gear to a great fairy to get it buffed, and I love how they did this. It's a big open world, so naturally people are going to find these great fairies in different orders, so whichever fairy you find first lets you upgrade your gear once. After that, each fairy lets you upgrade once more, and they all get the same ability, so you don't have to go track down specific ones to hit certain levels. It's a great example of how to achieve linear progression in a game with a non-linear structure. And oh man, my first time through, stumbling upon a new fairy felt like I'd struck gold. I was just so ecstatic that I could make my gear even stronger. I love the upgrading process too. I mean, these cutscenes are amazing. With each new fairy, you're like, oh geez, what's she gonna do to him this time? Do I need to look away? Most importantly though, I love using up my stuff. It's nice to feel like I earned my upgrades by killing lots of bad guys, and it can be fun to go off and try to track down that one frog I need to make my pants stronger or whatever. Then there's the added satisfaction of getting a bonus when you nab a full set and upgrade it high enough. It's fun to hold your breath waiting to see if you get something good. Sometimes you'll probably be disappointed, but other times you'll be jumping for joy. Climbing gear stamina discount, anyone? All these mechanics, meals, elixirs, armor upgrading, comprise what Nintendo collectively refers to as the crafting aspect of the game. And while it is enjoyable and certainly a great new direction for Zelda to take, get ready for some griping, because I feel that this is easily the single weakest aspect of the game, the area with the most flaws and the most room for improvement. These mechanics are definitely examples of older concepts being fully realized, kind of in a sense, but also kind of not fully realized. First problem. See, elixirs are the most complex to create. Like I said, the whole ingredient system is really interesting and fun to experiment with, but meals are so much easier to make, and they're still really good at buffing you, so I just go with them most of the time. Very rarely do I see a point in brewing up an elixir versus cooking a meal. And it's not just that meals are easier to make than elixirs, they're also just too easy to make in general. Don't get me wrong, I like that each ingredient gives a specific effect, and thus there's a logic to making meals. It wouldn't be as fun if every recipe was always a really specific list of ingredients that you had to learn somewhere or stumble upon by sheer luck. It would be kinda aggravating. But the ease of creation and mostly the abundance of ingredients in the world make buffs and heart recovery things you can absolutely take for granted. Why try using all the right critters and monster parts to make yourself an exactly perfect strength buff when you can just throw a bunch of mighty bananas into a pot and get a meal that recovers a ton of hearts and maxes out your strength? Even if you're not interested in buffs, meat is everywhere, and after a while you'll basically never run out of the stuff you need to make meals that heal all your hearts, which removes way too much of the challenge. Another annoyance, earlier in the game you can make meals that not only heal all your hearts, but also give you some extra temporary ones. Thing is, the temporary ones can never exceed the maximum number of hearts you can potentially earn on your own. So later in the game, when you have very few extra heart spaces, if any, depending on how you spend your spirit orbs, everything you make just maxes out. And it's like, great, it doesn't even matter what I throw in the pot. It won't make a difference anyway. It'll just heal me with no real added heart bonus. What you throw in means very little at that point. Like, if you're already gonna kinda break the system by making meals that easy to create, at least let me go all the way with it. Now, I am a bit torn here. It probably only feels like ingredients are too abundant because I spend so much time just messing around, and during my long travels, I naturally gather many ingredients. One could argue that this is why I've got meat skewers coming out the ears with no chance of ever being in a situation where I need hearts and can't get them. This could be my reward for being thorough. Easier play. And that's probably true. If I rushed through the game and didn't spend a lot of time exploring, things would be more difficult. I just think they could have hit a happy medium here. They could have made the cooking system intuitive without making it quite so easy to just lump everything together and get the best meal ever. Or, like with any of the elements in this game that I feel remove too much challenge, they could have placed more limitations on the system. I do like that bottles are an element of past Zeldas that the developers decided to overhaul in Breath of the Wild. Having a huge inventory for meals and elixirs without having to collect or manage bottles is very freeing and opens up the system a lot wider. But having fewer inventory slots earlier in the game or something would have made a huge difference here. Maybe you could upgrade your meal and elixir slots in the same way you upgrade your sword, shield, and bow slots. Just one example. In addition to meals being way too easy to throw together en masse, another problem is that effects granted from gear and effects granted from meals and elixirs don't stack. You can boost a stat 3 times and that's it. This means that once you get some good armor sets, there's little point in eating stuff to buff yourself. I like to go for attack more than anything. In any game, really, and once I got my full barbarian set, I had no more use for attack boosting meals. I could still go for meals that grant defense, but why do that? I've got 1,000 meat skewers to heal with and my barbarian armor protects me just fine. What's the point in worrying about defense? This isn't to say that the lack of stacking renders buffs completely useless. It's a little nice to be able to buff different stats without changing your gear again and again, so mixing buffs together is certainly a benefit, but it just feels like it limits you for no good reason. Breath of the Wild is all about doing it your own way and figuring out how to make the game work for you. So finding out that 3 boosts to a stat is all you get is really disappointing. Just like with the temporary hearts thing, it's like if the system is already kind of broken, you might as well let us go all the way. If I want to wear my fully loaded barbarian armor and swig some sword juice and get crazy powerful, why can't I? Also, real quick, while we're on the subject of buffs, it's super annoying that the game doesn't tell you how much a stat boost is actually boosting you. I hate this in any game. Defense up. Okay, up like 5%? 20? 50? 100? I have no idea here. Can I get an actual number? When it comes to its crafting elements, though, Breath of the Wild's greatest sin is that this isn't really crafting at all. It wants you to think it is. They even put craft your own adventure right on the back of the box. But it's seriously not. Crafting is taking materials that you've gathered and making stuff out of them. You might be able to take all this to a non-gamer and convince them that cooking counts as crafting. It does sort of fit the definition, but look at other games. Cooking is not crafting in other games. Cooking is cooking, or alchemy, or something like that, and most games with cooking also have actual crafting. And upgrading your armor? That's not crafting by any definition. At least not the way I see it. Going into Breath of the Wild, as you know, I didn't know much about it. I read that box and I was intrigued by the idea of a crafting system in a Zelda game. So I played it, and I played it, and I played it, and I wondered when I would finally find the person or the forge or the workbench or whatever that would let me craft stuff. I talked to every Goron on Death Mountain 5 times just to make sure I didn't miss anyone, and I kept getting these precious gems. Oh man, I've got tons of rubies, and look at that! Right in the description, they contain the power of fire. I can't wait to forge my own fire sword. Finally, I looked it up. Nope. No actual crafting in this game. And it's a shame, because monster parts and materials are so much fun to collect. I'll admit, there's a part of me that likes to collect them even after they become useless. Or I like to find really valuable ones, just because I could sell them for a lot of rupees if I wanted to, even though I don't really have much of a use for rupees, which we'll talk about in a bit. It doesn't make any sense, but in a very shallow, dumb sort of way, I like hoarding all of it. I do like that aspect of this game. But I'm also constantly disappointed that there isn't more to do with my materials. Upgrading armor? Awesome, like I said. But that eventually ends, and beyond that, the stuff mostly just sits there in your inventory. I mean, you've got quests and whatnot that use them. There are some little uses here and there, but nothing substantial, nothing constant and really useful. The closest thing to crafting in this game is having specific people in the world make a handful of specific things for you. Each race has a legendary weapon that can be remade whenever it breaks, but these weapons are generally pretty useless, as we've talked about before, and it's not even almost worth the trouble to get them remade. You can use your gems to create jewelry in a shop in Gerudo Town. You know, if you want to wear a headpiece and mess up your armor bonus. Or actually, you can use ancient parts to make guardian armor and ancient arrows at the Akala Ancient Tech Lab. This is actually pretty good. Armor only needs to be made once, but the option to make ancient arrows is decently useful. Even so, this system leaves a heck of a lot to be desired. The weirdest thing about all this is that the game feels like it was built with an actual crafting system in mind, but that they just didn't include it. I honestly think it might have been a crunch thing, like they decided at the last minute they didn't have time or something. I mean, think about it. In order for crafting to be a consistent part of the gameplay, you have to be able to craft something expendable, something that gets used up. So what kind of item does Breath of the Wild have that used to be permanent in your inventory but has now been turned into a consumable resource? That's right! Weapons! And also shields! Even arrows! They were definitely a consumable in the past, but they were so easily refilled. They were more like a meter than anything. Now they're a real item that you have to find or buy all on your own, and special arrows are more powerful and useful than ever. How on earth could they create a game where weapons and shields and bows work this way, and where you collect tons and tons of materials, and not give you the ability to craft stuff of your own? It's baffling. Never has there been a bigger missed opportunity in any Zelda game, or possibly any Nintendo game, period. Breath of the Wild is like some sort of beautiful animal that's inexplicably missing one of its legs. Like it was built to be a certain way, but one of its key elements is just kinda not there for some reason. But instead of just complaining about it, let's talk about exactly what they could have done to fix this and give Breath of the Wild a true crafting system. First off, imagine there are forges or workbenches or something where you work. The fun of cooking in this game is walking up to a cook fire and manually dumping in a bunch of ingredients instead of taking them to some guy who works in a shop. So when you craft items, it's all in your hands. You don't have to physically hold the items like you do when you're cooking, that would be too cumbersome, but you do go to the forge and do the crafting yourself. A fairly small detail, but a piece of flavor that I feel is very important. These whatevers are located all over Hyrule, in every town and stable. Enough of them that you never have to spend too much time hunting one down, but not so many that you can just craft your way out of any dangerous situation. At these things, you can craft melee weapons, shields, bows, and arrows of all kinds. Naturally, early on, your options are limited and your created weapons and shields are weaker. Special arrows are very costly. However, all over the world you find blacksmiths, and much like great fairies, each one passes on their knowledge and allows you to make stronger stuff that uses more materials. I could picture this so easily too, it's such a Nintendo gag. Hiya, I'm Jimothy from the Ancient Order of Blacksmiths. We're all over the place. Want me to pass on some knowledge? Ba-da-da-ba-da-da. Maybe some of them even require that you complete quests before they give you their knowledge so that you can't just run to each one at the start of the game. What you're left with here is a way to constantly use your materials if you so desire, and constant incentive to gather those materials in the first place. It's yet another feedback loop to make the game all the more addictive and empowering. Imagine yourself at the start of the game, using wood from a tree that you chopped down and some stone that you pulled from an ore deposit to craft the very arrows that you use to raid an enemy camp. Or imagine stumbling upon the last bit of flint that you need to craft a bundle of bomb arrows so you can use them to take down the stone talus. That would be so much fun! Plus, your growing weapon options would help bring logic and meaning to the game's progression system, which, as I said in an earlier section, is a little lame when it comes to weapons. Better and better items spawning just because you're completing shrines doesn't make a lot of sense. This, though, it's perfect. It's driven by you. It's your reward for being meticulous and slaying lots of monsters and exploring everywhere. It's worth noting, someone could argue that the ability to create weapons might unbalance the game, much like I've claimed having an unbreakable weapon would, but I don't think this is true. Weapons are already free. They're lying around everywhere. They just take a little work to get most of the time. This hypothetical system doesn't mean unlimited free weapons. You're limited by the amount of materials you've got and, of course, as always, the number of inventory slots in your bag. It would just be another option, and if you didn't feel like getting into any of this stuff, you could just ignore it and take all the weapons and arrows the game already throws at you. Though I will say, if you had the ability to craft special arrows, I would hope that the game gave you fewer for free. As it is, they're way too easy to come by after you've been playing a while. By the end of the game, even if I was still drowning in special arrows, it would be nice if it was because I made them with my own two hands, not because Lionel's dropped like 30 shock arrows at a time. And another note about spending resources on weapons. A lot of people have suggested that even if you can't craft weapons, you should at least be able to repair them. For a time, I felt that this made sense. It would be something to spend materials and/or rupees on, after all, and come on, in the real world, what do you do with a weapon that's breaking? You don't hit stuff with it until it breaks, you take it to a blacksmith so they can repair it. But the more I think about it, the more I think this is a bad idea. As I've said, hoarding weapons and worrying about losing each one is the best way to not enjoy this game. Things work out best when you just go for it. Use everything up without reservations, knowing that you'll always find more. Being able to repair a damaged weapon sounds good on paper, but in reality, it would mean having a full inventory and leaving behind great stuff all the time. It would mean lugging around low health weapons instead of just chucking them at guys' heads for extra damage, and on that note, who would ever throw their weapons if they knew they could potentially be saved? With the game the way it is now, I say a repair option wouldn't be terrible, but it's not the best idea. If the game used the crafting system that I've proposed, then I would say yes, it would be terrible. The idea of holding onto your weapons so you can fix them later would undermine the system of just making new ones constantly. Either way though, the game was built around weapons that are expendable, so making them expendable but also not expendable would kind of throw things off. Back to it, another thing that would be great to do with materials. How about different upgrade paths for armor? Like you could choose what kind of buffs to give it. As it is right now, you can sell armor and buy multiples of a single set, but it's like, what's the point? If you have the armor, why would you need more than just one version? Well, there's your answer. You could have one barbarian set that reduces stamina drain from power attacks, one that makes your sword swing faster, and one that only boosts your attack power twice but comes with a higher armor rating. There are so many options. The potential for mixing and matching is huge. Lastly, how about making offensive elixirs, like ones that you can chuck at your enemies? One kind could explode, one kind could put enemies to sleep or make them go berserk and attack each other, and one could attract bees and other aggressive animals. This would give us even more incentive to go out picking mushrooms, and just like with weapon crafting, it wouldn't be hard to implement. It would use mechanics that are already programmed into the game. Baddies can already sleep and attack and get chased by bees. It would be a really simple matter of giving us bottles to throw. And look at that, you've already got a dedicated throw button. What do you know? One final thing to say while we're talking about the game's resource economy. Rupees are probably more useful in Breath of the Wild than they've ever been, especially earlier in the game. They can be used to buy fancy armor sets and powerful special arrows and lots of stuff. Yet, I still wish there was more to do with them. If we had more uses for our materials, this wouldn't be as much of a problem because we would have less to sell and money would be more scarce. But as it is, selling unneeded materials nets you absurd amounts of rupees. Even if they really wanted to leave out a more advanced crafting element, it would have been nice to have something else to dump money into beyond special arrows because, like I said, eventually you just get tons of those. Buying a house is about the best money sink you get, and sometimes I get the feeling that it's satisfying not because it gets you a house, but because it gives you a place to dump your rupees and feel like you did something with them. Now, paying to help rebuild other parts of Hyrule would be awesome, though that whole idea is something I could talk about for way too long if I let myself, so I'll do you a favor and just not. So those, my friends, are the ways in which you interact with the world of Hyrule in Breath of the Wild. The fact that there was so much to cover on this subject says a lot. It speaks to the immense depth of mechanics on display, though unfortunately it also speaks to just how immensely some of them could be improved. Say what you will about the game, even if you weren't really impressed by it, though if that's you, I find it unlikely that you've stuck around long enough to hear this, you can't deny that the scope and complexity exceed any previous Zelda by a country mile and a half. Even if there is room to grow in some departments, a lot of room to grow, what we've got here is one heck of a starting point. If the Zelda team builds and improves upon it all in a sequel, then we're in for quite the experience when that day finally comes. So far, we've talked about the stuff you can do in Breath of the Wild, how you can go about doing it, and even how pretty it is when you do it, but now it's time to talk about the more tangible stuff, the actual check them off a list kind of goals the game puts in front of you. In basically all previous Zeldas, the main attraction has been that Zelda staple, the dungeon. This game does have a handful of what you could describe as more traditional dungeons, but the main attraction they are not. This time it's all about shrines, which are basically mini dungeons, micro dungeons even. I was a little skeptical of this whole idea until I saw just how many they put in the game. There are 120 of the things spread throughout Hyrule, and I believe this is a stroke of very genius game design. If in the past you were either working your way through a dungeon or navigating a forest or a mountain or something with very little overlap, now those separate kind of dungeon and overworld experiences switch back and forth very regularly. This keeps the experience fresh, and considering the rewards you get for completing shrines, they keep you constantly moving forward and pushing into new territory, always scanning the horizon for those little glowing blobs and looking for secrets wherever you go. And I won't go back into how they feed into the game's exploration and progression system, I've covered that plenty in other sections, but suffice it to say, with such a huge world, it's great to have so many shrines because there's just always something to do. These shrines were put in place by the Sheikah a super long time ago, and they were built to test the hero, or a hero, or who even knows at this point. They were made for you, and this is really excellent from a flavor and world building standpoint. See, most dungeons in past games were real places within their respective worlds. Spiritual temples, mines, prisons, anything. The fact that they were cleverly designed and filled with puzzles rarely made sense in terms of realism. These dungeons were really just dungeons so that the player would have something to do. That's video games. There's no real reason why there would be a series of block and switch puzzles in a sacred burial temple other than it's fun. But shrines are way different. First off, from a feel perspective, it's just awesome how they're inside of these massive underground spaces that are just way bigger than they need to be. They're so far down that you feel like you've been transported to another world, and it's cool to think about how all these shrines have existed for who even knows how many years, and the people of Hyrule have just been walking around up on the surface with no idea of the craziness going on under their feet. Also, the fact that these shrines were created to test the hero means that they make more sense within the world than previous dungeons have. These contraptions and puzzles don't need a reason to exist. They can be whatever they want to be and still make perfect sense. I know this is a pretty small detail that your average person probably won't care about, but you know me, I'm all about feel, and I think this is great. I will absolutely admit, though, that most important is how this impacts the game from a design perspective. The man-made, hero-tailored nature of these shrines had a massive effect on how puzzles were crafted here. The existence of these shrines is more logical than previous dungeons, yet their artificial nature frees them from being shackled to the logic of any individual location. Even if block and switch puzzles don't technically make a ton of sense being in a sacred burial temple, they still have to fit within the confines of the temple and mesh with the theme of the temple. All of this temple's puzzles have to kind of fit together. They have to make sense within the location, and they very often have to be built around whatever important item you get there. Shrines, on the other hand, can be whatever they want. They can be as big as they want. They can be super tall or super long. They can build into any direction at any time, and theme and logic be darned. They can feature whatever giant, ridiculous contraptions the dev team could possibly dream up. Again, this is excellent on a flavor level because it makes for these bizarre setups that can feel really dangerous and intimidating. But as always, more important is the freedom of design. If you can think it up, it could fit into one of these shrines. It can chomp, it can stomp, it can shock, it can burn, it can swing, it can launch, it can attack. It is absolutely wonderful, not knowing exactly what to expect when you head down into a shrine. You may run into a mechanic that you've never seen before. You may have to use your runes in a way that you never considered. You may have to fight a guy, or lots of little guys, or fight no guys at all and just do puzzles. Some shrines contain a tiny handful of puzzles in 1 or 2 rooms, and some seem to go on for ages, really living up to that mini dungeon descriptor. These latter ones are particularly delightful. There are so many small shrines that it's always really refreshing to stay engaged with one for a good long while. Naturally, the freedom of design we see in these shrines is thanks in very large part to Breath of the Wild's physics system and the runes we've been given to utilize it. A lot of the puzzles in this game are very unlike the puzzles in previous games. Previously, there were a lot more tightly designed head-scratcher kind of puzzles. Sliding blocks, torches, pattern memorization, that kind of thing. Breath of the Wild does have a fair amount of that, but it way more often employs a somewhat relaxed design. You've got a goal, and you've got all your runes to try and figure out how to achieve that goal. There are often multiple ways to go about completing a puzzle, and it's always interesting to watch other people play and see how their thought processes often differ greatly from my own. Let's take a moment to talk about each rune and how they affect the puzzling. Magnesis is easily the most versatile. As is the case with many of the game's mechanics, it's slightly surprising to me that the dev team was willing to give us an ability that offered so much freedom. Magnesis doesn't just let you pick up metal objects or push them and pull them or something, it lets you manipulate them fully, moving them around within a giant 3D space, no matter how big they are. This opens up limitless interactions and allows for very complex puzzling, especially considering just how many objects in this world are made of metal. Its impact on the puzzle design and the overall experience seriously cannot cannot be overstated. Stasis gets the award for biggest game breaker. Just about anything that moves can be frozen, smacked around, then launched at crazy speeds. Again, no matter how big it is. This mechanic brings a freedom to the table that is much more creative in nature. If you're gonna dream up some really wacky way to solve a problem, chances are it's gonna feature stasis heavily. It's especially fun because you can control the speed and direction of the object you're stasising, and it's a really tricky thing, but launching some giant object and having it land right where you need it to, like you're chucking a baseball or a golf ball or something, is extremely satisfying. Cryonis is very much a utility rune. It's not showy and game-breaking like Magnesis and Stasis, but it can still be extremely useful. The blocks it creates can be used to lift platforms, guide rolling balls, boost you up to high places, or even push things out of place. I especially enjoy Cryonis-heavy puzzles because they tend to be a little more traditional. Having many places to put blocks, but trying to figure out exactly which 3 places should get one is a ton of fun. Lastly, you've got bombs. They ain't the most nuanced rune in your tool belt, but when is an explosion ever not useful? Bombs have always been useful in Zelda games, but here they're made even more so by 1, offering both rolling and non-rolling varieties, and 2, providing remote detonation. Both of these features are positively genius because they increase puzzle application tenfold. Bombs also combine beautifully with stasis as they can be used to give a frozen object a ton of momentum before it gets blasted off. In fact, all of the runes interact with each other in fun and crazy ways. Each one opens up so many puzzling possibilities that what we end up with in Breath of the Wild is a seemingly endless supply of super interesting physics-based puzzles that can be particularly satisfying to solve. When there appear to be multiple ways to solve a problem, coming up with your own solution can feel incredibly rewarding. Like, instead of just figuring out exactly what you were supposed to figure out, jumping through just the right hoop and getting the answer, you invented a way to do what you wanted to do. It uses a very different part of the brain, I think. Much like with the difficult combat, it can make you feel like you really did something cool on your own. It feels much more like you earn your victory. Breath of the Wild shrine puzzles are really fun, but naturally I have a couple complaints. Sometimes I do find myself wishing we were given more traditional puzzles. Rolling giant stone balls and flinging around metal boxes and manipulating all these crazy ramps and things is tons of fun, but every once in a while I'm just like, you know, I could really go for a sliding block puzzle right about now. As we've seen with some other parts of the game, I love this new style, but I do sometimes miss the old style a little, and I hope that future games offer more of a balance between the two. A bigger issue is difficulty. There are indeed some tricky puzzles in this game, don't get me wrong, but I think just a few too many are a smidge too easy. Like the solution is painfully obvious. Sometimes you'll even have these big crazy setups, and you can tell that there are probably 100 different ways you can solve a puzzle, but then it's like, or I could just put one ice block right here and it's done, and you solve it in like 10 seconds. I suppose that's the price that comes with open-ended puzzles. You'll often find the weakest end and exploit it without much effort. I understand that accessibility is a big thing for Nintendo, but maybe just a few more extra tricky ones sprinkled in would have helped a lot. Fortunately though, I will say that the unique nature of these puzzles means that even the easy ones can still be pretty darn fun. Freezing just the right thing with just the right timing and launching something where it's supposed to go or whatever you're supposed to do just feels good, even if it only takes you one try to pull off. Well, that's all there is to talk about when it comes to shrine puzzles. I guess we can move on to... Oh, no! I had just blocked gyro puzzles from my memory. Don't remind me that they exist. You want to know what I think about Breath of the Wild's gyro puzzles? You want my detailed, analytical critique on them? They're awful. They're miserable and awful, and I hate them. You ever heard the phrase, Nintendo got a Nintendo? It's the idea that no matter how awesome a Nintendo game or product is, they've got this weird knack for including at least one little completely baffling thing that brings down the experience for no good reason. Gyro puzzles are this game's Nintendo just being Nintendo thing. The basic idea of tilting your controller or your Switch to roll some balls around or whatever is fine. I guess that could be a little fun. But most often, to do what you want to do, you've got to keep tilting and tilting and tilting, and it's not long before you reach a point where there's no possible human way to tell what movements will translate into what actions on screen, and you gotta just start the whole thing over or twist around randomly until you win by sheer stupid luck. The puzzles are tedious, the tracking is inaccurate, and trying to do any of it in handheld mode is a complete nightmare. I could probably complain about gyro puzzles for 10 minutes if you let me, so instead I'm just gonna stop here and say, what on earth were they thinking with this? Whoever approved these puzzles needs a Needs a stern talking to. Shrines may make up the bulk of Breath of the Wild's dungeoniness, definitely a real word, but it does very fortunately feature a handful of actual dungeons. You've got 4 divine beasts to liberate, and each one acts as its own self-contained dungeon. They leave a good amount to be desired, but they also do a lot of stuff very, very right. So let's start with the good stuff. From a flavor standpoint, these are probably the coolest dungeons in any Zelda game ever. I mean, come on, they're 4 gigantic, roving, robotic beasts that are so big you can see them from across the map. And yet they're dungeons. After an endless stream of sacred temples and lava caves and twisty tree places, these are an amazing breath of fresh air. They're just impossibly cool, and not the sort of thing I would have ever expected to see hanging around Hyrule. Then I love how each one requires a fun little chase kind of sequence in order to actually board them. These sequences are so unique within the game that it's a shame they're over so fast. They're these little bursts of excitement in my memory, and I'm always bummed that I would have to start up a whole new file if I wanted to experience them again. Makes me feel like the game could really use more of these fast-paced sequences, you know? Perhaps if they use the idea of latching onto roving enemies I presented in the previous section, or just sequences that require a horse, or take place way up in the sky with your paraglider, chasing monsters and hitting their weak points and stuff while you're zipping around everywhere. Just a thought, moving on. Once you're actually on board a divine beast, the dungeoniness truly begins. As is the case with shrines, the puzzles on display are generally quite terrific. In fact, since each divine beast has something of a theme, I would say that the puzzles here are some of the best. As I've said, I love how free and wacky shrine puzzles can be. That makes for very fresh experiences, but there is still something to be said about having a little more focus and having puzzles that link together to form a longer experience. The absolute best part about the divine beast, though, is that each one gives you a special command to manipulate it in some unique way. Generally, this involves moving huge parts of the beast around, and not only is this kind of dungeon-wide manipulation just plain cool, but it opens up really unique new design opportunities. The different ways you can move things around and how that affects the dungeon's puzzles and how you move through the dungeons, it's all exceedingly clever. The divine beasts offer up some of the most cohesive, interesting design we've seen in any Zelda dungeons ever. On the negative side, though, they're just too short. They're kind of like the fast-paced sequences that precede each one. They're great, but they're over so fast that they take up a really tiny chunk of your total time with the game, which can make them feel a little insignificant. Adding to this problem is the fact that each one contains very little fighting. Dungeons of old were a mix of puzzles and monster killing, but the divine beasts tend to only contain little handfuls of guardian scouts and blobby bubble skull guys that come out of the gross Ganon goop. It's really mostly about the puzzles, so there's always that little part of me that feels like something's missing from the experience. I guess I've just been conditioned to expect certain things from my Zelda dungeons. Then to top it all off, you've got something of a lack of individual identity. Each beast does have its own shape and manipulation mechanic and even its own puzzle themes, but none of these themes are as strong as those in past dungeons, at least not artistically. A fire cave might just be another fire cave, kind of boring, but when you're in a fire cave, you know you're in a fire cave. That's a very strong visual and thematic identity. Same with a crumbling ruin or a twisty spider-infested tree or the snowy remains of a castle up on a mountain. These divine beasts are really unique and cool, but when you hold them all up to one another, they feel awfully similar. When I look back on them, they have less of a presence in my memory, if that makes sense. They could almost all just be one big dungeon. The funny thing about these negatives, though, is that I can't count them all as completely negative. When it comes to something that's been done so many times over the years, I can really appreciate big changes like these. Even the less than perfect elements can be forgiven because of just how different this experience is. I do wish these dungeons were longer, but it's also kind of nice to not have to dedicate myself to finishing a massive, complicated dungeon before I can feel comfortable shutting the game off. I miss having more monsters to fight with mini-bosses and all that, but the greater focus on puzzles is also kind of relaxing. The divine beasts don't have a ton of visual identity when compared to each other, but the identity that they share is already so unique that I don't mind as much. Despite their shortcomings, I can very much say that I enjoyed the heck out of the divine beasts, and I hope a lot of the ideas they brought to the table are carried forward into future Zelda titles. We ain't quite done with divine beasts though. Zelda dungeons wouldn't be Zelda dungeons without bosses, and as such, there's a big mean boss waiting at the end of each beast. And just like the beasts themselves, these bosses are great in ways, but also have some shortcomings. In fact, it's funny, I'm pretty torn on almost every aspect. First, each blight is a nasty little mini incarnation of Ganon. You got Thunderblight Ganon, Waterblight Ganon, etc. As with the dungeons, these lack a very strong visual identity when they're all held up to each other, versus a giant spider, or a dragon, or a ghost, or some other thing we tend to see in Zelda games. But I can really appreciate how different the core idea of them is. I mean, they're really cool looking, even if they all look kind of similar to each other. They're super gross and scary, and they embody Ganon in a very new monster-like way that is not necessarily pig-like. Mechanically, they're designed much like the game's other enemies. They do have some specific weaknesses that you can exploit, but you can also just plain old do damage to them by hitting them with swords and arrows and stuff. And actually, that's probably the biggest problem right there. I can appreciate how open-ended the fights are. It's not the same use the right item and open their weak spot thing that we've seen 1,000 times, and if you really purposefully hit these bosses early, I'm sure you'd be in for a good challenge. But the way I play this game, it makes for disappointingly easy boss fights. As far as I can tell, these blights just don't scale. By the time I got to each one, I was powerful enough to make short work of it. The Gerudo one was the trickiest for sure, though not so much with all of my champion abilities and infinite healing items, and I was still fairly weak when I fought the Zora one since it was so early in the game, but for the most part, no. The game was like, you can fly around on the gusts and deflect its beam and shoot back the ice blocks, and I'm like, or I could just shoot him in the eye and wail on him until he's dead. In my eyes, bosses are some of the best and most memorable things in any Zelda game, so this is more than a little disappointing. You could easily argue that many past bosses have been laughably easy as well, and in fact significantly more so, and you would be 100% correct. But I just think if any game in the whole series was equipped to offer particularly good and challenging boss battles, it should have been Breath of the Wild. It's the wasted potential that's the problem. One more specific gripe about the Divine Beasts before we move on is that the game naturally pushes you to the Zora one first. I'm willing to bet that the majority of players do it before anything else. And this whole section of the game sets the bar really high in terms of what you need to do to access a Divine Beast. Vah Ruta is spraying loads of water into the air, creating perpetual rain in the mountain range that comprises Zora's domain. Since you can't climb in the rain, you've got to get all the way up the mountains on foot, and it's really challenging because the place is just lousy with shock arrow shooting Lizalfos. When you finally get up, you're rewarded with armor that lets you swim up waterfalls, which you just get to keep forever, and you have to use this to climb up Ploymus Mountain and either fight the Lionel up there or steal shock arrows from him so that you can use them to board Vah Ruta. It's this long and very fun sequence, and it makes the short length of the Divine Beast much easier to swallow. I don't know about you, but I was really excited to see what kinds of cool quests I had to go on to get on the other Divine Beasts, and what neato traversal abilities they might grant me as rewards. And of course, I was progressively more disappointed with each one I found. None of them can hold a candle to Vah Ruta. I mean, with Vah Medo, you go to Rito Village and they're like, go find Rivali, I think he's out getting lunch or something. So you walk over and find him and do like the easiest target test in the universe, and he's like, all right, let's go. And you fly up and do your thing and you're done. Vah Rudania is a little better. There are a couple things you gotta do, and you gotta figure out how to get up on Death Mountain without catching on fire, so yeah. Vah Naboris does indeed have a longer, more in-depth quest that you've got to do, but I wasn't too thrilled by it, and I'll actually talk about that more in a bit. Basically, the rest of the Divine Beast lead-ups are just bummers. I can deal with some being more cool and in-depth than others, but the fact that the very best one is basically thrown at you right at the start of the game raises expectations and ultimately leads to something of a letdown. So overall, there's a lot to like about the way Breath of the Wild does dungeons through both shrines and Divine Beasts, but there's a lot of room for improvement as well. The funny thing is that the biggest complaint you usually hear is that it feels like there's just not a lot of dungeon to go around versus the more traditional dungeon format of past games. But when you really think about it, is that true? There are 120 shrines in the game. 29 of them are blessings, which means the challenge comes from opening them up, and once you get inside, there's nothing to do but grab your prize and go, so okay, let's say 91 shrines. What's like the shortest time it takes to do an easy shrine? 5 minutes, maybe? So even at that low end, you're looking at 7.5 hours of shrineage, and we all know that some of them take way longer than 5 minutes to beat. Some are extra tricky and take a lot of puzzling out, and some are just long. I think 20 plus hours of working through shrines in total is a reasonable estimate. And sure, you don't have to do them all to beat the game, but if you're lamenting that there's not enough dungeon in this game, you're probably one of those people who is hunting down all of the shrines. Then, on top of all the shrines, you've got the 4 main dungeons. Sure, they're not the longest dungeons, but they're not the shortest either. I mean, Majora's Mask only had 4 main dungeons, and Wind Waker had like, I don't know, 2? 2 or something? I don't remember. These ones are a little short, but they're not insignificantly so. So altogether, I'd say there's a decent amount of dungeoniness in this game. So the interesting thing to think about is, why does it not feel that way? Because I kind of feel like it's lacking in dungeons too, if I'm honest, and I don't get why. My theory is that breaking the dungeon experience up into many smaller experiences makes it all feel a little less substantial in the end. No individual thing holds a giant place in your memory, so it kind of feels like you didn't get to do as much. None of the dungeony experiences have a very strong visual and thematic identity, as we talked about, so they all kind of run together and none of them are particularly memorable, even if they are still really fun. I'm not one of those people who was like super disappointed by Breath of the Wild's lack of more traditional dungeons, but as with many things, I do hope they can strike a better balance in the future. This was kind of nice for a change, but let's have some more striking and in-depth dungeons next time, even if it is still just a handful of them plus a whole bunch of shrines. Because for the record, I never want another Zelda game without a whole bunch of shrines. Before we move on from dungeons though, let's touch on two notable places in Hyrule that are sort of like dungeons, even though they're kind of not, but they're not like anything else in the game, so I kind of lump them into the dungeon category. The first is the hideout of the Yiga clan. Here you've got to venture deep into a canyon in Gerudo Desert and retrieve a Thunder Helm so you can board Va Naboris. I liked the thrill of visiting the hideout of the guys who had been trying to kill me the whole game. I like that this is a fairly large and unique area that's only used for this one quest, as we don't have a ton of those in Breath of the Wild. I like the silly little thing the Yiga Blade Masters do when they see bananas. Beyond those things, there is not much to like about this quest. This is the kind of auto-fail stealth section that I was happy to escape when I found that Breath of the Wild implemented stealth in a more natural way. When I got to the hideout and I saw that one hit from these billion HP Blade Masters would give me a game over, and that I couldn't save in the middle somewhere, I absolutely had to start all over whenever I died, I was just appalled. It doesn't really matter how strong you are. You cannot take a hit from these guys, and that flies in the face of the whole rest of the game and what it stands for. Now, I'm annoyed that I can't 100% fault it, because apparently it is indeed possible to kill all the Blade Masters and avoid having to sneak. Your reward for having the skill to take them out legitimately, or the resources to blast them all with ancient arrows, is a shorter, simpler ordeal. And hey, I'm always talking about how some challenges in this game are too easy, right? Shouldn't I be happy about this? But somehow I'm not. Really, I'm just annoyed that they would put a no-save, auto-fail section in a game that seemed to have broken free from things like that. It just seems wrong. It is cool how the place has a boss, though, even though he's, you know, too easy. The second slightly dungeony place is Hyrule Castle. It doesn't really have an end goal beyond climbing to the top and fighting Ganon and maybe finding its shrine, so at the end of the day, it's mostly just a place to explore. I'm a little torn on this, which I suppose is not surprising based on my opinions on all the other dungeons in the game. I was definitely disappointed that there wasn't more of a point to Hyrule Castle. I kept turning corners and expecting to run into something big. But when I look past that disappointment, I can really appreciate the idea of this gigantic, sprawling place that was made mostly for exploring. It's jam-packed with powerful enemies, and I spent so much of the game being too scared to even get close that finally creeping around inside and trying to find my way up to take an early peek at Ganon was a huge thrill. There is good loot to find, and that's obviously great, but most of the fun comes from just seeing the castle and how grand and beautifully constructed it is, and imagining what went down when it was destroyed 100 years ago. It's incredible that the dev team put so much effort into something that you barely have to experience if you don't want to. If you know where you're going and you just keep on climbing, you can get to the top fairly quickly, but if you're so inclined, you can spend hours exploring every nook and cranny, and you will find some decently interesting stuff if you do. I already mentioned the journals of Zelda and the King in an earlier section, but I would say another highlight is the Stalnox down in the dungeon that's guarding a Hylian shield. That's definitely one of those, whoa, I actually found something really cool moments. Also, surprise Lionel attack! Hyrule Castle may not be a full dungeon exactly, but hey, it does have a boss at the end. The final battle with Ganon is here, and we might as well talk about it. I had positively no idea what to expect when I climbed that castle for the first time. I was thinking, so is Ganon just like sitting there somewhere? Will I find Zelda hanging out with him? Am I gonna fight a giant swirly pig head? How do you fight a giant swirly pig head? How's this gonna go down? So I was surprised and thoroughly ooged out when I found a nasty Ganon cocoon pod chilling up in the tower. And I also did not expect the Ganon that came out of it to look quite like it did. We're used to the idea of Ganondorf having a regular old humanoid body, then turning into some weird pig beast when you fight him. The Ganon swirling around the castle the whole game is pig-like because he's given up his regular body and is in a crazy enraged form. So it's extra creepy to me that here he embodies his humanoid self, but in a very uncanny, monster-like way. I expected pure Piggy, but we got no Piggy at all. He's got a human-like face with a classically Ganondorf red beard and all these gangly human-like arms. This reflection of his original Gerudo self can also be found in the Blights, as I touched on earlier, and it's a terrifically fresh take on the villain. Even better though, Calamity Ganon's dwarfy features are made all the more creepy thanks to the rest of his design. Again, no Piggy here, even though I was sure there would be. He's more like a guardian. He's got a grotesque spider-like body. Some of his legs look like they came right from a guardian stalker. He's got ancient blades for claws, and he's even got his own laser beam arm. He's basically the ultimate guardian. And I know I've said this kind of thing about 100 times throughout this review, but seeing him for the first time, I thought, am I playing a Zelda game here? Like, is this really a Zelda game? Because this is very unlike any Zelda boss I've fought. Mechanically, I'm a little torn on this boss fight. When you just look at him and his attacks, he's the best boss in the game several times over. He's just got such a wide assortment of attacks. I've already expressed how I like the baddies in this game because you actually fight them. You, for the most part, don't just use an item to open them up like a puzzle. And Calamity Ganon is no exception. You're constantly moving, constantly dealing with some new attack or other, and deciding what specific way you want to deal damage to him. But then, just like with the Blights, if you actually played the game before you came to fight him, he's way too easy. You don't necessarily have to learn all of his attacks and figure out how to dodge them and deal damage if you just feel like spamming him with bomb arrows. On top of that, if you freed all the divine beasts, and again, who would not do that, the champions blast him down to half health before the battle even begins. When you get him down to about a quarter is when things should start to get difficult because he puts up this shield around himself, and as far as I can tell, the only good old-fashioned way to get past it is to perfectly shield parry his laser attack, and I don't know about you, but parrying lasers is hard as heck. Got your champion powers though? Don't worry about a thing. Daruk's protection parries it for you, and Urbosa's fury just breaks the shield all by itself. Mix in a heaping tablespoon of Master Sword, and you got yourself a defeated Calamity Ganon cake. I can definitely appreciate this in its own way. They want him to be easy if you played the game a bunch. That's your reward for conquering Hyrule. You get to just cruise on in there and kick his gross spidery butt. That's basically how it was in Majora's Mask. But it's just so clear that Calamity Ganon is an amazingly designed, amazingly fun boss that it's disappointing when the battle's over so quickly. You definitely can make it harder by not freeing all the divine beasts, which is something I might try in later playthroughs, but the first time was the most special time, and the memory of my first special time will always be just a little anticlimactic. Absolutely still fun though, don't get me wrong, and if anything, the weird visual design kinda made up for the low difficulty. It was still an amazingly cool fight. After you beat Calamity Ganon, you fight Dark Beast Ganon, but there isn't really much to talk about here, especially seeing as I already touched on him in the section on story. He's the standard Zelda final battle. Zelda gives you light arrows, and you ride around and shoot all his weak spots. Though actually, it is kind of unusual in how ridiculously easy it is. Most Ganon fights can still be at least a little challenging. This is very simple and by the numbers, and I don't even know if it's possible for his big laser attack to hit you. Like, can it? Have any of you guys actually been hit by that thing? But, like I said before though, I still think it's fun. I'm enough of a feel guy that I'll take something like this just to cap off the game. Some epic cinematic final sequence that exists just to be the epic cinematic final sequence. I mean, come on, look how big the guy is. Breath of the Wild wins the award for biggest Ganon ever. While we're talking about bosses again, let's take this time to touch on mini-bosses. There are 5 types of mini-boss that can be found all over the place, the exception being Molduga, which can only be found in Gerudo Desert. As with other baddies, it is a little disappointing that there isn't more variety here. I mean, there are some Zelda games with 8 or 9 dungeons, and each one has at least one mini-boss, and sometimes there are even a few outside of dungeons. But fortunately, these 5 guys all feel very grand and substantial, epic enough to feel like they could be actual dungeon bosses. Plus, for the most part, they're really fun, and I'm actually happy to fight them again and again. Zelda bosses have always been so much fun, but sometimes they're over so quickly that they're like this tiny little sliver of the greater experience. In Breath of the Wild, though, you've basically got all the mini-bosses you can possibly take on, and whether it's a hardy challenge or you're destroying them left and right, it's just something fun to do. Lynels are easily the toughest mini-boss of the bunch, and they're literally one of my favorite things about the entire game. I've talked about them quite a bit in previous sections, but I just love how challenging they can be. There are no tricks here, no items to open them up, no way to stun them beyond a very brief headshot stun that basically every baddie has. These guys are about good, honest video game play-in, learning attacks, reacting quickly, protecting yourself while also dishing out damage any way you can, and that's just so refreshing. Stone taluses are really fun. I love how they've only got one weak spot, and it can be tough to reach when it's on the back instead of up on the head, as taluses love to track you and try to collapse on you when they're stunned. I love how incredibly intimidating they are early in the game. They're just gigantic, they're made of boulders, and their main rock throw attack can smush you flat in a second. Even better, you've got fire and ice versions, and without the right arrows and gear, they can be extra tough to bring down. Hinoxes stand out because they're the most interactable. They're always sleeping when you find them, so sneaking up on them is pretty exciting early on. I was amazed when I learned that you can hang out on a Hinox's hand, and after a few moments he'll scratch his belly and lift you up, or you can rob him of all his loot without him even noticing. If you do want to fight a Hinox the old-fashioned way, and I must say I've never come across a Hinox I didn't want to fight, you're in for a good time. You can shoot their big ol' eyes to stun them, but after taking so much damage they'll start to cover their eyes with their hands, and trying to stun them anyway is fun. If you can't stun them, you've got to get in close to hit them, but then you run the risk of being squashed and squished and smacked. Sometimes they've got these guards on their legs, and I'm seriously clueless, because it also took me a long time to realize that you could burn off the wooden ones and shock the metal ones. Overall, there's just a lot to Hinox battles, and however you go about them, they're just fun to fight. Molduga are easily the most disappointing mini-bosses in the game. Visually, they're awesome. They're these gross, giant lizard fish monsters that swim through the sand like graboids. If you're out on the open sand, they can be really deadly. Problem is, once you find out how to kill them, they're a joke. Stand on a rock. The Molduga can never hurt you ever again. Throw a bomb, he eats it, you detonate it, smack him while he's stunned, and run back to your rock. Repeat until dead. It's probably the most traditional Zelda boss fight in the game, because it's got one major weakness that you exploit with one of your quote-unquote items. But at least past exploitable bosses have had attack phases after getting hit, and that's exactly what the Molduga needs. After you stun it and get in some hits, it needs to do something that forces you off your rock and actually makes the battle a little challenging. As it is, though, they're fairly blah. They are epic, and you can try fighting them using a sand seal for some extra excitement, but I don't really see the need to, and that's pretty lame. Finally, we come to Guardians, and I kinda lied. I said there were 5 kinds of mini-boss, even though Guardians come in a few different varieties. Stalkers are the nastiest, and really, they're the biggest bullies of Hyrule. Lynels are tough, but at least they keep to themselves, and there are weaker types to fight near the start of the game. Stalkers come in one very high-strength variety and just run around looking for little links to blast. I've already talked about how exciting they make the game, and for this reason they are also one of my favorite parts about it. They're horrifying magical robots that shoot you with an exploding laser beam. That's just crazy. Finally, getting strong enough to take one out is a very triumphant feeling, and getting strong enough to take them out easily is its own kind of satisfaction. The great thing though, even if you can usually chop off all their legs before they even get a chance to move, or jump down from somewhere and take them out with bomb arrows right to the eye before you hit the ground, get caught in a situation where they're running so fast you can't hit their eyes or reach any of their legs, you can still get blasted to smithereens. They should never be underestimated. Decayed Guardians can be found lying around some places, and I think these are really smart. They're weaker versions of Stalkers, and they're stuck in the ground, so they're easier to avoid, but they still give you a taste of that Guardian experience early in the game. It's always tempting to see if you can take one out, but if you mess up, you're gonna get blown to high heaven. Plus, you never know when one is gonna turn out to be not quite as decayed as you thought and get up and start chasing you, and that sows the kind of anxiety that I just love in games. Skywatchers are like Stalkers, but they fly around and have a more limited range of sight. You can damage their propellers to make them fall, but even then you've still got to deal with their lasers. And just like Stalkers, they can be stunned by shooting them in the eye, but panic and start missing and you're gonna have a bad time. They might not be as exciting as Stalkers, but they still add a hefty dose of fear to many of Hyrule's locales, and I love them for that. Turrets are only found guarding Hyrule Castle, and there isn't much to say about them. They stay put like Decayed Guardians, but they're tougher to beat. And hey, they got a blasty boom laser like all the other Guardians, so thumbs up. Finally, we've got the big Guardian Scouts that you fight in Test of Strength shrines, and these are actually pretty different from the other Guardians, probably because they were created exclusively to test the legendary hero. They were particularly fun to figure out because they've got a lot of attacks, and because of this, I would say they're some of the best baddies in the game. Their behavior changes the lower you get their HP, and each move they make requires a different reaction. And man, when they're charging their big laser, and none of your attacks stun them, and all you can do is wail on them and pray that you can finish them off before they open fire, That's good stuff right there. The last major thing to talk about in this whole entire review is quests. Previous games have all had quests, characters telling you to go fetch this, go do that. Majora's Mask introduced the idea of having them all in writing so that you could see what you had and hadn't done, and Breath of the Wild goes nuts with the idea. Anytime anyone wants you to do anything, it becomes a quest in your quest menu. This is excellent, obviously, because you can easily remember what you still need to do, but it's also great because it keeps track of important information about your quests so you don't need to keep re-asking people for your clues. I've mentioned before that shrine quests are the best, but let's touch on them again here. If you absolutely had to get a shrine quest from the right person before you could complete it, it would be pretty lame. The game allows you to stumble upon secret shrines on your own, which of course adds immensely to the game's sense of exploration and discovery. Again, I'd say these secret shrines with their own quests provide the most interesting and unique scenarios in the game. They're the coolest, funnest things to find when you're exploring the great big land of Hyrule. But then, if you haven't happened upon a shrine yet, but you talk to the right person about it, they can give you a nudge in the right direction if you should want one. For me, this resulted in a really great mix of finding cool shrines on my own and trying to puzzle out my active shrine quests whenever I was bored and wanted something to work on. Some of my very favorite shrine quests were Casses, because I just love riddles. Some of them were pretty easy, but a few had me scratching my head. Every time I was running around and I heard that accordion music float in from somewhere, I'd be like, oh yes, it's riddle time, baby! The only disappointing thing about shrine quests, basically any shrine where it's a challenge simply to find or access it, is that they usually end with a blessing, like I mentioned earlier. The game goes, good job, you already put in the work, so here's some treasure and your spirit orb, no puzzles needed, just sit back and relax, man. I understand why they did it this way, but puzzles! I love puzzles. 29 blessings out of 120 shrines is a whole lot of puzzling I wish I was doing. It's easier to forgive the blessings that come after crazy challenges like Eventide or the Labyrinths or whatever, but at least a handful of the blessings are pretty silly. Sometimes it only takes you like a minute to open a shrine, and it's like, come on, that was too easy to warrant a blessing. Give me some puzzles already. Beyond shrine quests, you've got regular old do this thing for me quests, and these are another mixed bag. I do really enjoy having all these quests, because if I'm in love with the mechanics and the overall experience of just playing a game, I don't care much what I'm doing in it and will jump at the chance to perform even the most menial tasks. Finding quests everywhere and having a great big list of them to tackle, I just love it. A problem, though, is that the rewards do not seem to scale with you here, and they are usually very underwhelming. It's not a huge problem because, like I said, it's fun to just do quests, but it would be nice if these people gave you stuff that was a little more helpful. I mean, you spend 10-20 minutes completing a quest and you get 100 rupees or a ruby or something? Pretty lame. Basically, most regular quests are just there for the fun of doing something and the satisfaction of checking things off a list. That's not going to appeal to everyone, but I can say it appeals to me enough to still be enjoyable. Though another thing I'll say, it's also pretty lame to get a quest that's like, can you go up the mountain and find me 3 rubies? And you're like, well, I have 300 of those, so here you go. Several quests are literally worthless if you hit them too late in the game. There are a good few quests that I found really enjoyable, but the best of the bunch just might be the Tarrytown quest, for a number of reasons. It's this long series of smaller quests where you have to find people with the right kind of name, so when I first played through the game, I was always excited to reach a new town and talk to all the townsfolk. Then the quest takes a lot of wood and rupees, and it's always nice to just use up some of your ample supply of materials. The best part about it, though, is that it has you actually building a town, watching new structures go up as you find new people. Having new shops to buy from is an okay tangible reward, but much better is the feeling that you're actually doing some small thing to restore this devastated Hyrule. Not only could the game use more of these long-term multi-stage quests in general, but I think just about everyone agrees that building and restoring structures is something that would just work so well in this game. Sure, it's nice that we get to beat Ganon in the end, and we know that Zelda will work to put things back in order, but Tarrytown gave me such a delicious little taste of this whole restoration idea that I was left wanting so much more. Similarly to how the game's material gathering and weapon breakage mechanics set the foundation for a crafting system that just isn't there, material gathering and the Tarrytown quest, along with the ability to build your own house, set the foundation for a building system that feels like it should be obvious but is also, sadly, nowhere to be found. There seems to be a pretty common trend running through most of Breath of the Wild's quests and what you could consider dungeony content. A lot of it is really, really terrific. The vast number of shrines with all of their physics puzzles, the visually epic and mechanically unique divine beasts, many of the other quests and challenges that really imbue the world with a sense of magic or are just plain fun to do. Sprinkled throughout, there are elements that bring the experience down, and there are some disappointing missed opportunities. But when I turn my intense scrutinizing machine down a couple notches and just focus on how much fun I had a ton of fun. I absolutely loved my time working through the game's various challenges, and it's much easier to look past flaws when I'm just so happy to be doing something very fresh and new for Zelda. Maybe there will come a day when the novelty of newness wears off and I find myself bored of physics puzzles and wishing for more substantial dungeons more than anything, but after hundreds of hours in the game, I can still say that this was a good direction for Zelda's dungeons to move in. It could all use some tweaking, sure, but this new format is one that I would be more than happy to see again. I believe that Breath of the Wild is a good game. You probably could have guessed that by now. But a big question is it a good Zelda game? One thing has been consistent throughout all of my time talking about Zelda with people on and off the internet, and believe me, that has taken up a significant amount of my life, and it's that Zelda means something different for everyone. Everyone has a different idea of what elements make a Zelda game a Zelda game. Want to do a fun experiment? Ask 5 people to rank all the 3D Zeldas from best to worst, and you will get 5 very different answers. And that's actually one of the things I love about Zelda. One person may play it for the story, another may think it's all about the fighting, another may think nothing is more important than dungeons, and another person may think nothing's more important than dungeons, yet still disagree with the previous person on which dungeons are best. But the whole what makes a Zelda a good Zelda discussion has never been as heated as it is now. Breath of the Wild changed Zelda. Every Zelda game has added ideas and tweaked them. Skyward Sword, in particular, as I've mentioned many times, probably changed the most at the time. But with Breath of the Wild, Aonuma and the Zelda team broke the system open completely. For the first time in decades, they took a great big step back and examined every single individual element that made up the series and considered, does this need to be here? How can we make this better? What if we did this instead? Even staple mechanics that had been there since the very beginning were not exempt from this great purge. A good few examples. Bottles. They're just gone. You've got a massive inventory and you can just collect materials with the push of a button, so there was simply no need to include a bottle system. Collecting heart containers. I never imagined we would get a game that threw out such a long-standing tradition as heart containers, but there you go. Spirit orbs are like heart containers in that you can trade 4 of them for 1 extra heart, but they're used for stamina as well, and they are exclusively given to you in shrines. You don't find them out in the wild, hidden in chests and holes. The overall dungeon format. No boss keys, no progression items to find, no mini-boss at the halfway point. Instead, we've got loads and loads of mini-dungeons along with 4 bigger dungeons that are very unlike anything we've ever played. The ability to jump. Like, to just jump whenever you want. You don't have to get Rock's Feather, you don't run at a ledge to make it happen automatically. You just do it with a button. Because why not? It makes sense to be able to jump in this world, it's really useful, so there it is. Special arrows. They have always been an ability that you get, and you use them to get past certain obstacles that were designed for them. Here you just get them. You don't get the fire arrow ability, you get a fire arrow. You can use it on a guy that doesn't like fire if you want, or a shock arrow, or whatever. They're a resource, they run out. Here's a huge one. You know Zelda games, right? You're this guy wearing these green clothes and you have that one sword. Not here. Where's Link's tunic? Well, he doesn't have it. Put on whatever armor you find in the world. Where's the Master Sword? Well, you get it later in the game, and even when you do, you can only use it for a little while at a time, so how about instead you pick up whatever weapons you come across and use those? I've played the game for so long that I'm used to it now, but sometimes I'm reminded just how weird this is. How weird it is to be playing a Zelda game where I'm wearing wacky outfits and using spears and hammers that I scavenged from enemies. Sometimes it doesn't even look like I'm playing a Zelda at all. There's smaller stuff too, like how you can move the camera around when you're talking to someone. It's not a huge deal, but it's still something where they were like, why not? Why the heck not? It makes it a little more interesting to talk to someone and still be interacting with the game and looking around. And you know that annoying sound Zelda games make when you're low on hearts? That whip-it-up, is awful. Gonzo. Breath of the Wild makes a noise to let you know that you're low, and then it shuts up. And you know what? It's not just the big changes that tell us how much they rethought the whole Zelda formula here. This little stuff says just as much. It means they really examined every single little thing and asked themselves if each one was something they needed. This game being so different, instead of people saying, I like this Zelda game more than the last one, or I like it less than the last one, or I rank it like this compared to the others, you've got people either seeing this as the best Zelda ever created, or something so different that it isn't even Zelda anymore. Obviously, there are plenty of people in between, but to me, it seems more binary than ever. And funny thing is, neither camp is wrong. Because what is a Zelda game? How much can you change a game in a series before it doesn't resemble the other entries in the series enough to be part of the series anymore? How much can get thrown out? How much do you need to keep? When is it healthy innovation, and when is it compromising a series identity? Breath of the Wild is very different from the other 3D Zeldas, but it actually has a lot in common with the first Zelda on the NES. There we were just plunked down in a huge open world and told to go. It's also a lot like Link Between Worlds, with its dungeons that could be completed in any order and its items that you could access at any time. If 3D Zeldas and 2D Zeldas are different in a lot of ways, does that mean they need to maintain their own identities without spilling over? If Breath of the Wild is wildly different from every other 3D Zelda but very similar to the original Zelda, does that make it the least Zelda-like Zelda game ever or the most Zelda-like Zelda game ever? If no other Zelda game had ever been created, just the first one and this one, how differently would we look at it as a continuation of the series? How much should a game be judged against the games that came before it, and how much should it be judged on its own merits? These are questions that we could spend hours going over. But at the end of the day, like I said, there are no correct answers. All I can do is answer these questions for myself. I can only tell you what I see when I look at this game. And I suppose I'm one of the lucky ones because these changes amaze me. There have been some sacrifices, sure. Like I've talked about, there are some traditional Zelda elements that have been left behind or diminished, and sometimes I find myself missing the purity of the old formula. But so much of the new stuff here is just incredible. It's engaging and exciting and challenging. And instead of feeling like the game has strayed too far from the Zelda formula, I feel like it elevates Zelda to new places, forges a path for bigger and better Zelda games than ever. And this new direction for Zelda didn't just happen because the team rethought every element and brainstormed new concepts. It's obvious that they drew heavy inspiration from other games. This is huge because Nintendo's teams most often seem, at least, to do their own thing when it comes to game design. And hey, that's part of what makes them so unique. But if you ask me, Zelda was in need of a shakeup, and looking outward was one of the best things they could have done to make that shakeup happen. The new elements that seem to have been inspired by other games are what make the game feel so fresh and exciting. A new mechanic is one thing, but a whole new system or style that we've enjoyed in other games coming over to Zelda, it's incredible. There's no way to know exactly what was directly inspired by other sources or what those sources might be, but the way I see it, there are 3 elements that have been largely lifted from other games. One source of inspiration seems to be Dark Souls and or Monster Hunter, or at least that style of game. Primarily, this is seen in the combat and boss difficulty. You can see it most clearly when you're swinging around a giant sword and fighting some huge guy. I mean, it really does look like Monster Hunter sometimes. It uses the idea of large, fierce enemies that you really have to learn in order to kill. As I've gone over many times by now, it's less about figuring out how to open up an enemy like a puzzle by using the right item, and more about just learning them and beating them with pure skill. This is a very new concept for Zelda, and I don't think it's any coincidence that these kinds of games were on the rise when Breath of the Wild was early in development. Another inspired element of Breath of the Wild is the survival element, and similarly, I do not believe this happened by simple chance. Survival games were also on the rise during development. I mean, the genre basically exploded around that time, so now we have the lack of recovery hearts and the need to gather food and cook meals and elixirs. This and the new fighting style obviously come from the team's desire to make Zelda more challenging, and this new level of challenge is part of what makes the game feel so much more rewarding than previous titles. Then, of course, there's the obvious one. The open world. Leading up to Breath of the Wild's release, Nintendo's games were only getting more and more linear. But again, what other kinds of games were on the rise when Breath of the Wild was being made? Just about every publisher out there was putting out open world games. They were creating gigantic worlds that you could explore in your own way, at your own pace, and that were packed with stuff to do. Whether or not that stuff was fun to do is up for debate, but they were still doing it. So the Zelda team looked at those games, then they looked over at Skyward Sword in the direction they had previously been taking Zelda, then they shot a quick glance over at Wind Waker before returning to Breath of the Wild, and they went, all right, let's do this. Let's give them what they've been asking for. Let's do an open world Zelda. And because they did that, because they decided to look outside of Zelda for inspiration and adapt all these new elements to the series, I believe we have a deeper and more engaging Zelda than ever. And before anyone says it, no, I don't think this means they should always just copy exactly what the rest of the industry is doing. They shouldn't just follow trends, but they should always keep an eye out for ideas that could legitimately enhance the Zelda experience and carefully select which ones to use, as I believe they've done here. And you know what? I will completely admit that the game probably doesn't deserve quite as much credit as it gets for these changes. The rest of the game industry grows and develops together. Games constantly borrow concepts from each other and try to improve on old formulas. Should we really praise the Zelda team for finally looking at what the rest of the industry was doing like they probably should have been doing to at least some extent this whole time? Should we praise this game for, in a sense, merely catching up to other games when it comes to a lot of its mechanics? If countless other games have perfected the survival concept, why should we give Zelda so much credit for only dabbling in it? If other games have been offering deeper, more challenging combat for years, why is it special when Zelda does it? Nintendo fans often treat the company's games like they're in their own special little bubble, and I will completely admit I probably do that sometimes as well. I'll admit that it's special when Zelda does it because, to me, Zelda is just special. Nintendo franchises have this way of burrowing into my heart, and when I boot up a game, if it's got the name Zelda on the cover, it's already at an advantage in my eyes. Is this a rational mindset to have? I'd say yes and no. Sure, maybe I am being a little biased here. Maybe I hold these games to a different standard sometimes. I don't really know, and I don't know if I can know. But there's nothing wrong with being captivated by that certain kind of Nintendo magic. I don't think there's anything wrong with being so enamored with the style and feel of the Zelda universe that if Zelda uses a mechanic, I'm more likely to enjoy it than if another game does it even better. It's like, come on, man, that is a bias. But it's also like, I know that other game uses this mechanic too, but Zelda uses it here. I couldn't tell you exactly what Zelda magic even is or what elements come together to create it, but whatever it is, it's real and it's got me. Zelda games almost always meet a certain quality standard in my mind. They let me go on adventures the likes of which I just can't get anywhere else. And even if another game's got perfect survival or crafting or combat elements or anything, it still doesn't have the benefit of coming together to form a complete Zelda experience. Even with its flaws and underbaked elements, Breath of the Wild is still a Zelda game when you look at it as a whole. It's still got that quality and magical feel. It's still the kind of adventure game that for whatever reason, no one else is really making right now. No one ever seems to make adventure games that feel quite as good as Zelda does. And speaking of flaws, as we've seen in this review, this game's got plenty of them. It is so different and new that there are some crazy growing pains. Even its inspired elements need a whole lot of tweaking and refining. The survival stuff is great, but the game's got some issues with difficulty balance. Eventually, it becomes too easy to pick out on all the health regenerating items you want, and the ability to eat them in the pause menu without interrupting a battle compromises the new level of challenge. Then there's the whole system of material gathering without a proper crafting system to go with it. There just isn't enough stuff to spend your money and monster teeth on. The progression system could also use some work. Getting stronger simply by picking up stronger weapons as the game scales up doesn't feel incredibly empowering. A proper XP system or something like it would work much better. Then of course there's the story and the ending. I went to town on the game there. I mean, geez, I probably spent half my review complaining. This game has a lot of problems, lots of niggling annoyances and missed opportunities. But it's a perfect example of how I can think a game is incredibly flawed, but still consider it one of the best games I've ever played. Because I do think that about Breath of the Wild. I still need more time to decide if it's my absolute favorite game ever, but it just might be. This is really a larger discussion for another day, but I don't see a review score as this objective measure of a game's quality. When I'm scoring a game, the most important factor is how much I enjoyed it. I'm not going to do the whole, give Breath of the Wild a 7 out of 7 thing at the end of the review. It seems silly to do that at this point. But yeah, for the record, if I'm going to score it, I am going to give it a 7. And yes, that's despite the fact that there's so much wrong with it. It's because the stuff that it does right, it does so right. Even if I felt like it could have been better considering what it brought to the table, it still provided what was possibly the most magical experience of my video game playing life. I honestly can't remember a time that I had more more fun with a game, felt more unbridled joy while playing it. Certainly not since I was a kid, back when that magical feeling was much easier to find. Games just don't tend to affect me as much as they did when I was a kid. My ability to lose myself completely to a game has gotten a little weaker over the years. But Breath of the Wild tapped back into that kid in me. It brought me back to Christmas mornings when I could boot up a game and just stare at it and wonder. When I could just lose myself in a game for days and days and truly feel like I was experiencing something special. I was going on a grand adventure. And I know it's kind of a weird thing to say, but all of Breath of the Wild's flaws are kind of exciting. Think about it. If I was able to enjoy the game this much, despite its laundry list of issues and missed opportunities and seemingly missing mechanics, that means that as long as the Zelda team wants to continue with this formula, and statements from Aonuma himself plus sales figures make that all but a sure thing, the only way to go is up. Future games can only get better. Way better. Impossibly better. Sure, it would have been cool if Breath of the Wild was just the perfect video game right out of the gate, but where could it have gone from there after setting the bar so high? I'm kinda glad I got to be blown away by its crazy open world and some of its new elements, because now I can potentially be blown away all over again by a more fully realized version of this new formula. I mean, I guess I don't necessarily know if the team will work on improving what they have here, or if they'll just scrap half of it and go in yet another new direction, but they've got the potential to do something amazing with Zelda. Something truly unprecedented in the ever-crowded landscape of open-world adventure games. The Zelda magic used to live inside its own little box, and it was a wonderful box, but it was still a box and one of its own creation. But this game has broken free. It moves the series so far in such a new direction so quickly that now it feels like the sky's the limit. And for that reason, I would say it's the most important game since Ocarina of Time, for both the series and Nintendo as a whole. It shows a willingness to take inspiration and break traditions and try exciting new things that the company has sorely needed for years. It shows that they're willing to make a game that doesn't hold your hand, and that they finally understand how gamers want challenge, they want depth, they want to forge their own adventures. Nintendo will never be perfect, and at the risk of sounding overly pessimistic, I know they'll never fully live up to the potential I see in them. They just don't have the same priorities I do. But Breath of the Wild paints as bright a picture as I could ever hope for. It says something very profound about Nintendo's shifting mindset, their potential, and the kinds of games we might see from them in the future. It seems we have come to the end of my little review of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Perhaps it doesn't come as a surprise that I was able to talk about the game for hours, considering how obsessed I am with it. What does surprise me, though, is how even after all that time, I still can't say I've touched on everything. There are countless things I just couldn't fit anywhere, or I decided to skip for the sake of something that in some universe resembles brevity. Like blood moons. Didn't even talk about blood moons. I can sum them up right here, though. Ah! Ah! I am going to die! I am going to die! Is it over? What happened? Then I mentioned Eventide once or twice, but I could probably talk for quite a while about that one quest alone. It's incredible! And you've got Kilton and how he can make disguises that let you blend in with monsters, and the ability to take pictures of things and hunt them down with what is essentially a radar? That's a whole thing in itself! It's like a fully realized version of the dowsing idea in Skyward Sword, but you know what? I gotta draw the line somewhere. This review does have to eventually end. I was originally gonna end the whole thing with another heartfelt bit about how special and amazing Breath of the Wild is, but I think I've made my point by now. So instead, I just want to say thank you. If you stuck with me through this entire review, then I seriously thank you from the bottom of my heart. The idea that even one person on this great big planet would want to hear me talk about one game for 3 hours is absurd, but all you guys, it just feels amazing, and all the comments and tweets from people who have enjoyed it throughout its production have warmed my Zelda-loving heart. And while I'm thanking people, give it up once again for Kane from Farfetched Reviews for editing this entire thing. He is the link to my Zelda. I've been doing a lot of brooding, trying to figure things out, locked in what's felt like a century-long battle with scripts and mechanics and analyses, and he's been doing all the dirty work, wielding his sword of editing against the calamity that is this review. And with that, my friends, I will take my bow and bid you all adieu. Gosh, I've talked about it for so long that, you know what I think I might just do? I think my Switch and I are gonna spend a little time playing something else. Woof! I am sick of Breath of the Wild. When's the next Zelda game come out already? Know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna play some Mario. Yeah. Good old run and jump Mario. Yep. Hey, look, a moon. Yeah. Got that moon.